Before we dive in, just a quick note. This is a pretty long tutorial, so I highly recommend using the timestamps in the description. You can jump straight to the sections you need and skip the parts you are not interested in. If you want to practice, my recommendation is to go in order, because otherwise you might skip some important parts. I also mentioned a few extra useful timestamps in the comment section for more general explanations that aren't included in the main timestamp list. Hello everyone, today we are going to do a deep detailed breakdown of a small part consisting of a few scenes from video that I personally really like, called The Insane Truth About OpenAI, which currently has around 1 million views. I think there are a lot of valuable things here that beginners and intermediate editors can learn. Asset link will be in description and completely free, while the project file will be available for a small fee, since I've invested quite a lot of time into it and into this tutorial. And I wouldn't want someone to just download the file and click away from the video. I hope you understand that. I have no idea how long this video will be, but I'll be as detailed as possible so everyone can follow along easily. I won't be recreating this scene from scratch because the video would literally last dozens of hours. But I'll go through my own project file in great detail, covering every possible aspect of the edit, every small detail, every movement. I'm sure something will slip through that I'll forget to mention, but just ask me in the comments, no matter how trivial it might seem, literally anything. But before we watch the scene that we are recreating, let's talk about MagnatesMedia. Magnates is one of the largest documentary style channels, and it's famous for a very unique approach of interpretation, where they take a simple 2D image in depth and create multiple layers that are placed in 3D space in different positions, producing so-called parallax effect and a sense of depth in every scene. In addition, they are known for seamless transitions and paying attention to small details. So let's watch the scene with some brief commentary, then watch my version and break it down step by step.
Studied computer science at Stanford, but he dropped out to work on his own business.
So the first we notice is that in the very first scene we already have at least 4 to 5 layers. The boy, the green surface, the university building, the large bright sun, the sky, and this tree, which is later used as a transition in scene 2.
But he dropped out to work on his own business. It was called Looped, and it was
In the second scene we again see 2 layers, him sitting on the computer and the room background, along with this cool flickering effect.
It was called Looped, and it was a way of sharing your location.
After that, we have a matte effect, where the entire scene is placed inside of a circle, which at first glance looks quite simple, but it isn't just like that.
With friends using your phone. However, since Sam started Looped before the iPhone and the App Store even existed.
And then we got this shutter effect, followed by a very strong scene with a mystical face covered in shadows underwater.
This proved to be a challenge. But Sam worked tirelessly on the business.
Next, there is another scene with just 2 layers, which then transforms into a completely different scene, where the image feels like they are placed behind scratched glass.
Living off instant noodles and ice cream. In fact, he worked so hard and his diet was so poor that he actually developed.
What's specific here is that the inside layers that are already placed in 3D space, we have entirely different scene that has its own parallax within one of the images. Then the camera pushes through the scratch glass layer, turning that image into a new scene.
Scurvy. Then in 2005, he joined the first ever Y Combinator class, which is basically a bootcamp for startups. And it was here that Sam attracted the attention of Y Combinator's founder, Paul Graham. Paul had a lot of business experience.
After that we have 2 more scenes, one with a speech being delivered and another with 2 people sitting at the table in a dark room. At first glance this might not look overly complicated because there is no flash effects or aggressive edits. However, there is an incredible amount of detail you need to pay attention when creating scenes like this. The biggest challenge is definitely the layer arrangement in the timeline and their positioning in 3D space, which directly affects the speed and behavior of these layers when the camera moves. Now let's watch my version. I paid close attention to every detail and the result is very close to the original, I would say, aside from a few minor differences and things we'll cover later in this tutorial. Elon Musk studied physics and economics in University of Pennsylvania, but he dropped out to focus on starting his own company. It was called Zip2, a digital guide meant to help newspapers move their content online. However, in the time Elon started Zip2, early internet technology made this a very difficult challenge. But Elon worked tirelessly on Zip2, often sleeping on a small couch and surviving mostly on coffee and snacks. In fact, his work ethic was so extreme that his friends became worried about his health. But in 1996, the company gained major funding, bringing Elon into contact with investors and mentors who saw his unusual drive and ambition. One of those mentors who guided him was Greg Curry, challenging Elon to think bigger and take risks few founders would dare. Greg also noticed something peculiar about Elon's work habits, his intensity, his relentless focus, and his willingness to sacrifice almost everything for his goals. First part is generating script, tutorial purpose only. This part is not directly related to editing, but it can be very useful if you want to practice and have unlimited source of material. You can skip if you are not interested. First, we need to get a transcript of the video we are going to edit. Just Google free YouTube transcript generator, pass the video link and it will generate the full script. You can download the entire script or just a specific section. For this video, we only need a small part. My section starts around here and ends around here. Next, open ChatGPT, pass the section along with the timestamps and ask it to generate a new script using a different person or a businessman as the subject. In my case, I use Elon Musk. Imagine. At first, ChatGPT will usually generate a script that doesn't properly fit the timestamps. As you can see, you can't realistically fit that many words into 7-second segment. So you need to prompt it to follow roughly the same number of words and pacing between the timestamps. After that, you get something like this. Then I manually customize it, making sure each line closely matches the length of the original script for every timestamp. I think the final result turned out very well. Honestly, this doesn't take much time at all, especially when you're working with 1-minute footage. But I don't recommend you to use ChatGPT for writing serious scripts. Now let's get down to business. Next part is generating assets. Actually, there are several ways we can generate assets. The first method is to find each layer separately. For example, in the first scene, this would mean finding separate image for the boy with backpack, the grass, the university buildings, the sky. This approach gives you the most freedom and control, but it takes a lot of time. It will produce better results, but you won't always be able to find exactly what you're looking for, especially if you don't have paid access to asset websites. The second method, of course, is generating images with some AI tools. You can also use free tools like ChatGPT or Gemini. The problem with this method is that for backgrounds you usually need wide, high-resolution images to have enough space for the parallax effect. That's where the upscaler comes in. If you decide to generate free images, they will often be low resolution, so you need an upscaler to improve that somewhat. I've been using upscaler software for a while. It has its own paid website, but there are other ways to get it. You know what I mean. You can also probably find free online upscalers. Check the Reddit for recommendations. With this method, Photoshop is very important, but don't worry, most of the work is repetitive actions, nothing too complex. You just need to separate the layers correctly. We'll go through that when we start editing. The third method, for practicing purpose only, is to literally take a screenshot of the scene you want. Then use Gemini to generate just the background. For example, generate only background of this image without person. Then you type now generate only the person sitting at the desk and place a white background behind them. So you can easily remove the background using a background remover later. This is a very effective method, but again only for practice. We are not stealing anyone else's ideas or content. Of course, you can also tell Gemini to generate the same background, for example the same room, but change some details like swapping the orange light with the green atmosphere or other small tweaks. Nano Banana is very good for these kinds of tasks. Once you generate the background and the main object separately, you can upscale them and they are ready to use in the project. And now we move to scene 1. So we open After Effects, create a new composition, 9020, 1080, 30 fps and start with scene 1. Let's watch it again and get assets for the scene 1.
Sam Altman studied computer science at Stanford, but he dropped.
The asset download link for this video is in description and it's completely free so you can follow along. This scene is an open type scene and we need width because the camera will move sideways, and we also need depth between the layers to achieve that parallax effect. That means our assets need to be high resolution in order to look good. We are not going to generate this scene using AI, instead we will use stock websites. I personally use FreePic paid version and have annual subscription that I bought during Black Friday sale for around 85 euros, which is absolutely worth it. I know some of you might get annoyed at this point, but that's just how it is. If you want to do editing seriously, you need a subscription to at least one stock asset website. Without it, things get much harder and your options are far more limited. I've been there, done that. I will also use this moment to show the first method of sourcing assets we talked about earlier, but applied in practice. Let's start with grass for the first scene. Let's start by finding a grassy surface that looks like pathway or the front yard of a house. So we'll search something like green lawn. This one looks nice, but it's not what we need. The angle isn't right. We are looking for a front approach of a house or something similar, so let's add brick house to the search. And now the perspective is already much better. This one, for example, could work. We might need to scale it down a bit, but let's try to find the exact one I used. Oh, here it is. Look at how perfect this is. Why? Because we can simply mask out the trees and the green surface in Photoshop and we instantly have our layer. Simple and fast. Next we need a university building and clouds. The university doesn't have to be from Pennsylvania specifically, we can just search for something like university front building, also in panoramic, and you'll see a huge number of images that could work. I personally shortlisted these two, which you can easily use as well. But I went this one. I clicked transparent PNG and we are done. You can download whichever image you like as long as it fits the purpose. Now for the clouds. With clouds you just need to make sure they look similar, not large and not moving too fast. Any clip could work, there are tons of them. All that's left is boy, which will generate using Gemini. Sorry that the prompt is in Serbian, but you can type something like generate an image of a 15-year-old boy facing away from the camera, looking straight ahead, wearing a backpack with the University of Pennsylvania written on it. You'll get a result like this. Then I took a screenshot and told Gemini that I wanted the same style, and we ended up with a perfect image, complete with shadows and sunlight highlights on the arms and head. You can generate that directly with a good prompt as well, but this is faster way. After that we go into background remover. There are plenty of free ones. We download the image, move into upscaler, select the image, and boom, that's it. Now let's move quickly into Photoshop. We'll drag the image into PS, go here, select the selection tool, select the quick selection tool and start selecting. We need this bush area and this entire green surface, without the trees because I don't think we really need them. Once the selection is done, we click the little camera icon to create a mask, and that's it. Now go to File, Save As and save it as a Photoshop file. However, this is just masking for this scene. In MagnatesMedia editing style, it's often necessary to isolate an object in an image and then replace or fill that area using content-aware fill or better generative fill, so the space is filled with the same or similar content as the rest of the image without that object. In this tutorial I didn't edit any scene this way, but this is a very important skill you need to master. In a moment, 2 clips will pop up that I highly recommend watching. It's not complex and you can learn it in about 15 minutes, but please don't skip this one, you will need this for this editing style. And now finally editing. This is my project file. Sorry if it's messy, I put it together pretty fast, but I'll try to explain everything as clearly as possible. This is a pre-comp for scene 1 and 2. Import the assets we prepared for scene 1. I've disabled all effects for now and we'll go step by step. So basically everything below this point is essentially scene 1 featuring the kid, while everything above is scene 2 with the room and computer. You can identify them by the layer names: tree, room, kid with backpack, Photoshop, low layers, and so on. We'll start by placing the layers in 3D space. You can do this intuitively by feel, or you can enable the tool view layout and check the side or top view so you can see the 3D space and layers. So we have 2 university building layers, the grass layer, the boy with backpack, the tree, and the clouds. If you look at their positions, you'll immediately see what's going on. Now comes the most important part, the core idea. In Parallax scenes, which is basically every scene in MagnatesMedia style, the background is always placed the farthest from the camera, meaning the deepest in 3D space, and it's also the layer we scale up the most. You scale it just enough to fully fit the frame and extend beyond the edges, so when the camera moves, the layer doesn't fall out of frame or appear too small. The closer a layer is to camera, meaning the smaller its Z position value, the faster it moves and the more it reacts to camera motion. The farther a layer is, the less it reacts, which is usually the background. That difference in movement between layers is what creates that parallax motion and gives this 2.5D or fake 3D depth effect. Following that logic, in our project, if we open the position values, we can see that the clouds layer is placed far back at around 4.2K at the Z-axis. Then we have 2 university layers, which are closer to camera, at the same distance around 2.5K. The grass is slightly closer since it sits a bit more in the foreground, but the difference isn't critical. Don't stick with these numbers blindly, I'm just showing them to give you an idea of what we are doing, I'll explain later. The boy with the backpack is placed much closer compared to these layers, because he's the main subject of the scene, and everything else is positioned relative to him. Then we have the tree, which is extremely close to the camera lens. The reason for this is that when the camera starts moving to the right, when we switch the scenes, the tree is the element that needs to react the most to that movement and really sell the parallax effect. Once you place the layers correctly along the Z-axis, the next step is scaling and positioning them so the scene looks natural and how you want. As I mentioned before, you scale each layer just enough for the scene to feel realistic and to make sure there is enough space on the sides, especially along the axis the camera will move on, whether it's the X-axis, left or right, or the Y-axis, up or down. Now I'm going to be very detailed, maybe a bit boring, but it's important that you understand how this effect works on this example, because later I won't go that deep every single time. We'll see this clearly on the example of the boy. When we play the movement, we can see that in the frame, right before the transition to scene 2, his elbow almost touches the tree. That's because he's slightly further from the camera than the tree, which sits around 400 on the Z-axis. As you can see, the camera itself is positioned roughly minus 2.7K. Now, if we move the boy from 1.4K to around minus 200, just for example, on the Z-axis, scale him down and reposition him to look identical in the frame, then go back to the main scene and play the camera movement, you'll notice that he leaves the frame much faster. His elbow disappears from the frame much earlier compared to when he was placed further from camera. So if we wanted to slow his movement down even more and make him overlap with the tree for a longer time, we will push him deeper into scene and scale him up accordingly. So in short, if a layer is further back in the scene, it moves more slowly, enters the frame first, and leaves it last, depending on whether the camera is moving into or out of the scene. If layer is closer to the camera, it enters the frame later, leaves it first, and moves faster through the space. If this feels confusing, rewind to scene 5, Boy with the Noodles, where I explain this in detail using 2 layers and camera movement. It's actually very simple to understand. Jump straight to this section if anything isn't clear. It will be much easier when you get how the camera lens work in 3D space, because you need to understand that before you move on. Before we move on, there is one more very important thing, the layer order in the timeline. If a layer suddenly disappears while you're adjusting the Z-axis, this is often the reason. Because you moved the layer that should be on top, below the other layer. It sounds trivial, but it could happen. Be mindful of the visual order and stack of your layers in the timeline, based on depth. Objects that are closer to the camera should be higher in the layer stack, while distant elements like backgrounds go lower. It doesn't always have to be that way, but it's a good rule to follow. After we finish positioning and setting up a scene, let's break down layer by layer and all the effects applied to them. When we look overall scene again, we can see that everything has its warm orange tone, the clouds, the buildings, even the bushes and the boy. We'll start with the clouds. I added a standard lumetri color with some tweaks in basic correction. This depends on your specific cloud footage, but to get this orange look, we go down to color wheels and adjust all 3 wheels to reach the desired result. As you can see, while I tweak them, the orange tone changes, something becoming more red or more yellow. You can also use levels and curves to dial the exact tone you want. Was it that apocalyptic scenario with stronger shadows or a slightly more faded version like mine? Literally make it however you like. It's all in these 2 or 3 effects. For the other layers, I basically only changed the color as well. On the grass, I slightly increased the temperature in lumetri color, or you can also do it with color wheels. Both work fine. While on buildings, I added a tint effect, blended it about 50% to give it that subtle orange reddish color to simulate the warm sunlight you can see on the original clip, like during the late afternoon or sunset. Of course, you can adjust this to any tone you prefer. Now that we covered the basic layers in this scene, there are 3 more elements we need to create before moving on the final touches and extra details. Those are, of course, the sun rays, and the lens flare reflection from the sun. Let's start with the most important, sun. Let me isolate the layer so you can see it, which in my opinion looks really good. This is made by creating a simple ellipse shape, placing it behind the university buildings layer, both in the timeline and the 3D space, so the effects don't overlap, and then scaling it up. By the way, while recreating the sun, I decided to make a few small changes to the clouds in background so we can get that blended look like in the original clip. Wait a second so we can see, yeah, you can see the difference. We achieved this by lowering the contrast and slightly reducing the whites, because the clouds create too much separation and end up looking too colorful. I think it looks better this way. Also, since I had to record another voiceover anyway, I want to mention that the sun isn't a perfect circle shape. As you can see, its width is slightly larger than its height. I added a gradient ramp with a dark, deep color on the left side and a bright yellow on the right. This is important because when we add a deep glow on top of that, to get that shine, it tends to wash out colors, and we need that slight color difference on the left side like in the original clip. As you can see, deep glow is set pretty strong, a radius about 500 to create that glowing halo effect, and exposure at 1.6 to control the brightness of the sun's core. In the reference clip, the sun itself is very bright and almost white. Finally, set the blending mode to add. If you leave it on normal, you'll see it doesn't look right because of the gradient ramp. You can try screen or others, but the does become too transparent for me. Add mode gave the best result. In the clip, there is also a subtle orange ring around the sun. I recreated that by making a new very bright orange solid and masking a circle slightly larger than the sun. Then increase the mask feather to make the transition more subtle, so you don't get a hard circle around the sun. With mask expansion and mask feather, you basically control the final look, the size and the smooth you want it to be. Now you just adjust the opacity depending on how visible you want that ring to be. You could even go a bit stronger than mine, it depends also on the brightness and contrast in the sky and the background, so everything is connected and adjustable. I can't get exact the same feel because we don't have the same cloud footage in the background and the clouds are blending with a bright circle. But you can see the difference. This is my final version that I made before the tutorial. This is the original video and this is my video right now that I'm finishing for tutorial. So you can see how much better it looks now after I changed the clouds and this outer sun glow. It feels much more clean if you ask me. So we still have two more things to create, the sun rays that add life and extra energy to scene and this cool lens reflection from the sun. Let's start with that one. We get that lens flare by creating a simple black solid, adding the lens flare effect to it and setting the blending mode to screen, so the black background disappears. All we need to do then is choose the lens type. I think 105mm is the most subtle one. It gives you 2 or 3 small circles and the large one that moves across the screen, which is perfect for that feeling of the sun or camera shifting. For it to actually work, we need to animate the flare center. For example, we place it to the top left at the beginning and then near the end of the scene we move it further to the right side. That way the large flare slowly travels across the frame and gives us that natural cinematic feel. What you need to pay attention to and what's a bit annoying is that you can't control the distance between the flare center and the yellow ghost element that we actually want. So when you try to position that yellow circle precisely where you want it to be on the screen, white circle can sometimes drift into the frame, which obviously shouldn't happen, so be careful with that. Anyway, to make the effect a bit stronger, more interesting and more unique, I also added BCC lens flare, where I tweaked the size, count and the color of polygons, flares, discs and so on. There are literally a million settings in there, and I mainly just lowered the global intensity of that to a value that felt right to me. And when we jump into main composition, it looked like this. Here you can clearly see the light beam from BCC lens flare, which I personally really like, because it adds the extra details to the sun ray. As for keyframes, I animated the BCC lens flare to follow a similar movement at the first flare effect, and I also keyframed the flare brightness to slowly decrease in some point of the animation, as well as the overall layer opacity at the moment it passes over the kid. It gives a smoother and more natural fade out. And that's all for this one. Now the sun leaks. You can see these small shimmering light rays on the sides that gives the scene even more life, and you can see them in my clip as well. They are visible enough. If you isolate the layer, you can clearly see how these sun rays look. Technically, you can apply the CC light effect directly on the sun layer, but you will have much less control over where the rays appear and how they move. That's why I think it's better to create a black solid once again, add fractal noise effect to it, because this effect generates black and white patterns across the solid. And then CC light rays effect will use that contrast to emit rays from the white areas. After that, you add a thinned and color those rays to the desired tone. In this case, it's orange. That's roughly how the effect works. Now let's get into more detailed settings. Here, I mask the layers so the rays only appear in the part of the frame where I want them. If we remove the mask with the current settings, we get something like this. The key part of this setup is pushing the contrast in fractal noise very high, because at 0 there is no contrast between black and white on the solid, and as you increase it the rays start to appear. Brightness also affects the look, so you can experiment with that until it's right. To make the rays move and feel alive, instead of being static, we need to animate the evolution of the fractal noise. Evolution makes the noise move all the time across the solid, and CC light rays keeps pulling light from different white areas as they move. The more circles it makes, the faster light changes. Another very important setting is complexity. If you want sharper, more defined rays, lower the complexity and vice versa. I probably should have reduced this to around 3 to 4 with these settings, but everything blends nicely in the final composition anyway. At the same time, you also have controls inside the light rays effect for intensity, radius and softness of the rays. I won't go too deep into that, you can see how they change as you adjust them, so just dial in whatever looks good to you, or you can copy the settings, I mean it's up to you. I explained which settings you should pay attention to and how the effects works overall. The rest is up to you to experiment and find what looks best for you. Finally, send the blending mode to screen, add a tint like we said and a bit of blur, just to soften the edges even more, and that's it. This layer is also set to 3D because we want it to move with the camera. We place it right behind the boy, both in the timeline and the 3D space, and then position the whole layer where we want to be in the screen or in the scene. Now that everything is built and positioned in 3D space, we can add an extra Souce. Since the whole scene has this orange tint, we'll add another 2D orange solid over the entire scene and set the blending mode to overlay, soft light, light or even multiply, with the opacity around 5 to 15%, just pick whatever looks best to you. You can also see the left side of the image is heavily blurred and less defined, with an extra orange glow, like the sunlight reflection across the lens. You'll also notice that the edges of the objects have duplicated pixels in different colors, slightly shifted to the side. That could be 2 or 3 effects. How do we get blur? We create the blur using adjustment layer with Gaussian blur set around 80 to 95, with repeat edge pixels enabled. And then we mask out the area where we want the blur. Don't forget to add mask feather so it blends smoothly into the rest of image and doesn't look that harsh. The extra orange glow is another 3D solid, masked only around the area near the objects under the sun. About the shifted colors. The shifted color edges are created with chromatic aberrations effect or combination of optic compensation and 3D glasses effect. Be careful with the order of your adjustment layers because, for example, we don't want this effect to affect the boy with the backpack, only the background. I used aberration myself, but throughout the whole clip I couldn't get it to look exactly like the original. You have controls for horizontal and vertical field of view, point of interest in each color channel and its fall off. Every adjustment gives a different result, as you can see, so it's up to you how strong you want the effect to be. Another way we can achieve a similar effect is, like I said, to add adjustment layer, apply optic compensation effect to it, set the field of view from 15 to 25 and check reverse lens distortion. Then add a 3D glasses effect, set it to left view here on the adjustment layer, and below change 3D view to balance color red and blue. And then tweak the balance. The strength of this effect, as you can see, depends on the FOV and balance, while the position of the color shifting depends on view center or the anchor. Try chromatic aberration and try this method and see which one works better for you. Honestly, I couldn't figure out how to make it look this clean on both sides, with extreme color separation on the edges, but without heavily distorting the image. So I ended up keeping it at very low values. And okay, I almost forgot, the last thing we add is the white particles. Just a simple stock clip, set screen blending mode and place in the 3D space. Set to screen blending mode and place into 3D space. Align with the plane of the 3 around Z axis, 450 with the opacity lowered to about 32%. You can even go a bit lower if you want it to be less distracting while still adding a subtle layer of depth to the scene. Now that the visual side of the scene is done, we can move on the camera movement, the object blur and the tree, which acts as a transition between two scenes. Let's start with creating one node camera, set this to around 50mm with the depth of field enabled, because we'll use focus distance and aperture even though we don't rely on them that much. It's mainly to explain how they work, since this will be useful for this style. Next, go into camera options and set iris shape to hexagon. Because the blur created by the aperture is more realistic, it gives a better cinematic feel. Now when I open all the keyframes by using U, don't think I did anything crazy here. These are just the small adjustments. Let me explain. Here I adjusted focus distance and aperture. Keep in mind that these two options only work if depth of field is enabled in camera settings. You can see the focus distance along the Z-axis if you enable 2view, and that line represents the exact point the camera is focusing on. How sharp that focus is depends on the aperture value. If you crank it up high, let's say 200 or 300, everything else starts to blur heavily. If you keep it low, it only slightly blurs objects in the background or of the size that are not the same in Z position as the focused object. So focus distance defines where the camera is focusing at the moment, and aperture controls how much everything else that's not at the distance gets blurred. This is very useful if you're working in a scene with multiple important objects on different Z positions and want to shift focus between them. It can be very cinematic without moving camera at all. By the way, one very important thing in general about precomposition in 3D space: focus distance and aperture settings only work if collapse transformation is enabled on the 3D comp layer, because that option opens up everything inside and places those layers into the real 3D space of the main composition. If this star icon is turned off, the precomposition is treated more like a 2D flat layer with an internal 3D world, where the camera, so to speak, cannot enter the precomposition or read its internal 3D space and depth information. Proof in my example that everything works: if I, for example, reduce the focus distance from 3000 to 300, you can immediately see a heavy blur because nothing remains in focus. The same applies for adjusting the aperture. Here I added a subtle aperture at start. As soon as the camera moved down from the sky, everything was in focus. In the original clip, you can see the boy blur slightly as the camera moves to the right. I think it's much easier in this case to just use a regular Gaussian blur on the boy and the tree, because in the original clip the background never actually blurs, so there's no need to use focus distance or aperture. Also, there aren't any other scenes in this video where shifting focus would make a big difference. Alright, so now let's move on the camera movement. The first camera move, the one that starts in the sky and ends here, is done without any null objects, and it needs to feel explosive. I'm not sure if it's even necessary to show the camera keyframes, because it's really simple. You set the first keyframe at the start, decide how long the move should last, then place the final keyframe based on how you want the scene to look once the camera settles. After that, you just adjust the animation speed in the graph editor. That's why we use a graph that goes almost straight up to 90 degrees angle. I assume that while you are watching this video, you already understand how graph works, but let's go over it briefly and explain how the camera behaves with different curve shapes. In short, the steeper the curve at the beginning, the more of the movement happens there. In this case, about 60% of the motion happens in the first half second, while the remaining 40% is spread out very subtly over the next 2 or 3 seconds, exactly as this curve shows. After this movement in the original clip, we transition from scene 1 to scene 2 with another strong sideways movement. The movement is attached to a new 3D null object, so we can create what's called a continuous smooth motion. I assume you also know what a null object is. But for those who don't, in short, its purpose is to act as a control object that we parent the camera or other layers to. The camera and those layers follow every change made to Null, such as position, scale, rotation, and more. We use it so we don't have to animate each layer individually, but instead connect multiple layers to one Null that controls all of them at once. But why Null and the camera? If you animated only the camera, you would see the moment where the first move stops, right here on the graph, before the sideways move begins. We don't want that pause. We want the camera to flow from one movement into next while the first one is still finishing, and that's what the Null objects allows us to do. So we create a 3D null, parent the camera to it, and you can see that the sideways movement, which is just y-axis movement, starts just before the first move is fully finished. But this graph cannot look like the first one, because then the motion would still feel too sharp and noticeable. Instead, as in the original clip, we need a slow subtle start, then a fast powerful middle, and finally a soft smooth ending. That means the curve has to peak around the middle. That's where the strongest motion happens and where we get the most motion blur, which is exactly what we want. Simple but effective. And that's almost it for the first scene. But, however, we still need to talk about the tree and the blur. In the clip we can see when the camera finishes the first movement and starts slowly moving sideways, the boy begins to blur while the tree comes into focus. This could be done using camera aperture, but I recommend that if there are only a few objects, the scene is short and you want to isolate just one layer, use Gaussian blur. It's much simpler. So we have keyframes for the boy and the tree when it comes to Gaussian blur, as you can see. No need to explain much about Gaussian blur keyframing, really. By the way, let's focus on the tree a bit because it's very important for the transition. First, position and effects on it. In the clip you can see the tree moving like it's in the wind. It's not static. We achieve this effect by adding a turbulent displace effect. In my settings I use turbulent smoother and you can see the amount, size and complexity. You can tweak amount and size a little as you like, but not too much. What really creates the movement we want is evolution. This controls how fast the animation on the tree evolves. I use 260, but you can experiment. I forgot to mention, we don't want the effect to affect the whole tree, because that would look wrong and the trunk would move unnaturally. So we click the tree layer, create a mask in this shape, then check inverted so the effect only affects the leaves, not the trunk. Then in the turbulent displays here, composition settings, click the plus and select mask 1, meaning the effect will only apply to the masked area of the tree. After turbulent displays, I added lumetri color to boost the saturation and adjust the temperature, giving it that orangish tone. As for position, as you can see, the tree is clearly the closest layer to camera, because it needs to sit between the two scenes without showing the other layers throughout the whole scene. It must follow almost the exact movement as the camera. If we remove the tree, you would see the two scenes roughly stuck on top of each other, and the transition would look terrible. That's why we need a tree that perfectly fits these requirements. It can't be thin or sparse. It needs a full canopy that starts from the bottom of the image. I found this tree on FreePic. There are a lot of options in the paid version. As you can see, the tree is scaled up massively, even to 200%, so it fits the scene. It's easy to say it now, but looking back and creating the scene, you will struggle with tree size, Y option position and hiding the contrast of the black background from scene 2. All of this needs to be adjusted until it looks right. There is a lot of tweaking around. But in the final version, I noticed a few frames around the sideways movement still showed some contrast from the sky, grass and the black background, and it didn't blend perfectly. I fixed this by adding another solid with a gradient ramp from green orangish yellow left side color to near black on the right side, because scene 2 is dark and coming from the right side. I masked this solid vertically and added mask feather to about 85 to create that subtle transition. Solid position isn't the same as tree position, it's slightly behind so it moves slower with the camera and consistently sits near the transition between those overlapping layers from the scene 2 and the scene 1. So I think everything from scene 1 is already explained. I didn't show how to move the camera manually, but honestly I don't think it's necessary. It's very transparent and you can clearly see the keyframes, values and what's happening. In the end, you always move the camera by hand, based on how you set up the depth of your layers, their scale and your specific assets, so don't just blindly copy the position values. Before we move to editing scene 2, which is technically much simpler and has fewer details, let's look at how we got the assets for it. These assets were created with method 3. I simply took a screenshot of the original scene and set it to Gemini, asking it to generate only the background of the room and to fill it with a missing space with a matching environment. Then I asked it to generate the same person that was missing on this background. In my case, I asked for a young Elon Musk sitting at the same table with a white background so we could easily separate him later using a background remover. The result was very good. Then I upscaled the image and brought it into After Effects. Now, when transitioning into scene 2, layer order becomes extremely important. All the layers from scene 2 are above scene 1 layers except room background, which is under the tree and transition solid. So tree can overlap both scenes and make a perfect transition. If you drag room background up, you see the result. But if you look at the scene 2, we can see it only consists of background, the room, and Elon at the table as the main foreground layer. And of course this flickering PC screen effect and the coffee smoke. But about them later, we are now focusing on the transition layers. If we disable them, we can see what the scene looked like before we started working on it. The layers from scene 1 are still there and they overlap. But if we place the tree properly and the solid that covers the transition, all you need to do is to put new layers from scene 2 above the scene 1 layers in the timeline so they cover them. Then you place them at the correct depth in 3D space so the black background or the room doesn't move too fast or too slow, which would reveal the transition. We do this by placing the room background at roughly the same distance as the grass in the university building layers from the scene 1, so they move identically through space. That's why the room background is placed around 2.2K on the Z-axis, like those layers from scene 1. As we said, this scene is pretty simple. You just add a bit of lumetri color to boost the shadows and color so its look more premium. If you think those highlights on Elon's body, his face, his arms and the table are some special effects, they are actually nothing more than part of the image generation prompt, where you specify the room's atmosphere. That is dark, the light bulb is orange and the screen is casting color light onto his face, hands and the table. They are not effects. These two main layers don't have anything else important, we'll just cover their movement at the end of the scene. What's left is the smoke coming out of the cup. You get that by creating a simple shape, just a small vertical line, then go down in the settings, shape, stroke, taper and taper start and end length to 50%. After that add the wave warp effect and set height to about 13. Width about 30 and wave speed to your preference. This is very important because it controls whether the motion looks subtle or aggressive. And then we add the vector blue. Set the settings to perpendicular to soften it a bit, and that's it. There are many ways you can make this theme look different. You can play around with and experiment. To me, this theme looks better than the one in the original clip. What's more left on this scene? It's this cool screen light effect that casts light on his face. I played around with a lot here and it turned out great. So what did I actually do? I created a solid, masked it into that light shape, then duplicated it several times and played with the colors. I have multiple layers, solids, that are basically identical. Some are white, some are orange, and on some of them I boosted the color like this orange one that sits near the end. So basically the layers differ in blending mode and light intensity, in this case opacity, and maybe slight difference in mask feather, nothing special at all. Then we have the screen layer itself, which is basically just a vertically masked solid with a strong glow applied to it to imitate the screen. On top of that I added a subtle deep glow to each layer and a strong noise to give it a texture. To get this blue and red color separation from the screen and the subtle red on the edges of the light, we add adjustment layer and apply chromatic aberrations once again. 10 on red, 4 fall-off distance, and then you move the point of interest and the horizontal and vertical field of view until it looks good. Now, to tie everything together and finish it off, we add CC spotlight to get this soft, rounded fade out of the light, which I think looks much better than keeping a hard edge light shape. You can see the settings and where my from and to points are. If you disable it, you can see how it looks in the main comp. I honestly think this looks even better than original. Now all that's left to do is to add a subtle flicker to 2 of the layers, either manually with keyframes or using a wiggle expression. Though manual gives you more control. Just pay attention to blending modes and opacity. They are not all set to normal and the intensities are different. That's up to you. This could probably be done with 3 solids instead of 5, but I experimented a lot. And both the smoke and the screen layers are pre-composed separately and set to 3D, because they need to follow the desk and Elon constantly, meaning they sit at the similar position in 3D space and are placed above in the timeline. We still have 2 small things left. One is the green light on the side. Let's look at it. You can see this light here. Honestly, I don't know exactly how it was done. I just downloaded some green light clips that appear in the sky, rotated the clip, adjusted the speed with time ramp and tweaked the opacity. For opacity, I did the expression, hold Alt key, click stopwatch near the opacity and copy this expression, which means opacity flickers from 12 to 18 at speed of 10. You can change all of this like you wish. The last thing I personally added is a slight head movement on Elon, just to make the scene feel more alive. We did that using the puppet pin tool. Since the person and the desk are part of the same image, if you only put one pin on his head, moving it would also move the computer. So we need to place a lot of pins across the body to limit how much area each pin can affect when it moves. Once that is set up, on the frame where you want the head movement to start, hold Ctrl button and slowly move the head right and left. This will automatically create keyframes over the time you are dragging. Or you can simply select the puppet pin you want and set a start and the end frame. That gives you a small subtle movement, because why not? And now that we explained the whole scene, what happens next? In the clip, we see this cool transition where the entire scene compresses into this circle and it slowly fades out in the company logo. To do this, we need to use a track matte on a circle shape. So that we don't have to track matte layer by layer, I pre-compose scenes 1 and 2 together. Now this is where it gets interesting. Create a shape layer in the form of a large circle that goes outside of the screen, so that when it starts scaling down, it covers everything on screen. Set it to 3D because it will later become an object on the screen, the company logo, and parent it to a null object that you create, which will be responsible for the scale down movement. In my case, it's null number 31, as you can see named zoom out circle. The null's anchor point and the circle shape anchor point must be in the center of the screen, because if they aren't, any scaling will cause visible distortions as soon as it starts shrinking. The most important thing that this whole scene depends on is that we split the pre-composition and take the second part, or the splitted part, and set it to track matte on the circle shape we just created. So the pre-comp is visible only inside of the circle. So we just stretch the pre-comp like this and press Ctrl button Shift D, and we split the layer. Why are we doing this? Because the scene inside the pre-composition is not large enough. If I had tried to fix this in proper way, I would have had to go back and redo a lot of things, which would easily cost me another hour of work. Here's the problem. If I had left as it was and kept the pre-comp parented to a null that scales down, as it should be, the scene inside the circle wouldn't be large enough to keep up with the scale down speed from the null object. and you would get a result like this. It's simple. If you take the precomp position inside the circle and scale it up at this frame, you'll see it looks much better, which means that's the issue. So we go back. The splitted precomposition is not parented to null anymore. Instead, it will have its own scale down, which I'll manually adjust so it never falls outside of the circle. Then we generate a zip2 image with Gemini, because I couldn't find any high resolution image of this company. You can use any high resolution image for practice, it will be easier. I even had to use motion tile here to enlarge the image inside of a circle. Now we set the logo image to track matte the same circle shape we created earlier, the same one that is also used as a matte for the break composition of scene 1 and 2. So to sum it up, for now we have a null that handles the scale, we have a shape circle that is parented to that null object, and both the split frag composition and the zip2 image are track matted to the same circle, so they stay visible inside of it. When it comes to null object, we see that the scale goes from 100 down to around 40% over 4 seconds. We also see that the scale starts very early, even before the camera fully settles in the scene, in order to keep a constant sense of motion. That means the graph needs a very moderate easing, a strong middle, and a smooth, gentle ending. On the other hand, the precomposition scale goes from 100% to about 75% instead, and graph-wise you should manually adjust it so the peaks of both scale graphs from the null and the precomposition happen roughly at the same time, or ideally exactly same time, to make the motion feel perfect. In my case there is a small delay, but nothing critical. As for the logo, it is parented to the zoom out null object just like the circle shape, and its opacity increased from 0 to 100% over 3 seconds, with very subtle start, which means the graph needs to look like this and peak exactly when the new scene is established and Elon is still visible inside of the circle. Perfect timing. And at that point, it effectively becomes the separate object in the new scene. And that's where we close this transition and move on to the next scene. For the new scene, let's look at the video once again. So in the center we keep the company logo, from which these little lines appear and connect to these pins. In the background we have something that looks like Google Maps with a clearly bluish color. We have visible darkening at the top of the scene, we have aberration, we have the blur on the sides. Everything is subtly zooming out, and then the map wipes into a blue background with some kind of liquid objects that constantly morph into something else. And then 2 new circles appear, and that's where we stop. Let's start with the background. So this is just a random map, either you try to find one like I did, or you simply generate one with AI and upscale it. As you can see, the map layer appears at the moment when the null starts scaling down in the previous scene. From the very beginning, it is large and it's parented to the same null that the precomp of scenes 1 and 2 and the shape circle were parented to, which means it allows every change in position, scale, rotation, and everything else that the null performs. So the background is also in 3D because the null is 3D. It's slightly rotated on the x-axis, nothing special, I just thought it'd give a more interesting viewing angle. For effects on it I added 2 tints, because obviously the map wasn't pure white. I set a blue tint at 27.5% tint amount and a little bit of a green at 7.5. After that we have a lumetri color where I slightly boosted saturation and, very importantly, reduce exposure to -2 to give it that darky look, not opacity, because that would make the layer transparent. We also have the blobs wipe, which is for the transition to the next scene. We'll come back to that later. There is no really philosophy around the map. We knew that when the circle starts scaling down, a blank background would be left behind that we have to fill with this Google Map image. If you're wondering, how do you know that size the image should be before the null it's parented to performs its scale? That's already the basic null and parenting principles. You go to the end when the null finishes its movement, and there you set how you want the scene to look at the end. So I wanted map to be this big when zoomed out, which means you parent it to the null, and at the end of the movement, not at the start, you adjust the position, scale, rotation of that layer, in this case map, not the null object. By the way, if anything about scene setup or parenting is unclear, ask in the comments and I'll explain everything. More or less that's it for the background. Next are these pins. You can grab any pin image you like. There's a big selection of flaticon.com, which is free. And we also have these lines that appear. First we'll handle the technical side, then we will deal with small details and effects. Both pins and lines are 3D layers because we are doing a scale down with the null object, so it's important not to mix 2D and 3D layers, otherwise the movement won't match in space. Speaking of space, as you can see, the lines in the timeline must be below the circle shape and zip to image so they don't overlap. How do we create the lines? We create the lines using the pen tool. Point 1, hold the shift and then set point 2. So it's a straight line. Now we animate them. Click the little arrow here, then go add, trim paths. I already did it, now I'm just showing. Go down here where it says end, animate it from 0 to 100 for the desired timing, and set the grab so it explosively starts drawing line and end up smoothly. When the animation retracts, we go with the inverse grab. Just look at this line here. It starts slow and disappears fast. Then you can duplicate this line, adjust their length, but do not do this by just clicking the layer and stretching the whole thing. Instead go to shape, path and move the points to adjust the length and position. Once you have enough lines, slightly offset the timings for each so the animation feels different. For the pins, we animate their scale and rotation. Anchor point is key here. Place it at the bottom of the pin so all animation happen from that point, giving a different animation look. If you put the anchor in the middle, you can see how it worse and generic looks like. So after setting the anchor point, take the scale from 0 to desired size and rotation from negative to 0. Regarding the graph, same philosophy as the lines. Explosive entry, and when the scene fades out, the graph goes inverse. Just copy a large number of pins, play with their spawn time and disappearance timing, so they don't spawn in the same time with the same animation. You could pre-compose this to make the timeline cleaner, but as I mentioned, my project is messy. Regarding layering, they sit on top of the scene above the shadow as we can see. The only layer above them is the blur vignette. After that, when the null zoom out from the last scene finishes, we have another subtle zoom out that lasts for a few more seconds. Create a new null object, rename it, mine is subtle zoom out, and attach the old null to this new one. This way all the layers previously connected to old null are now also linked to the new null, and all changes it makes will affect them. Once again I repeat, always pay attention to anchor points of null objects. It's best to keep them in the center of the scene constantly. If you want to change the anchor while the layers are parented to it, you must unparent all the layers first, make the change and then parent them back. That's why it's crucial for the first null to be perfect, and afterwards you just parent it a new one, and so on and so on. It makes fixing mistakes super easy. However, to create transition to this blue background, we take an ellipse shape and pre-compose it so we can work more easily with a single layer. Inside the pre-comp, we either have two shapes or big one like I did here. You can see that if I turn the turbulent displace, it's just an ellipse, not even a perfect circle. So we apply turbulent displace to it. I set the displacement to bulge smoother because I liked how it looked the most, but you should absolutely experiment with this one. This is definitely the effect doing the work here. The point is that amount and size should be at high values, so we get this kind of morphing and basically create multiple shapes out of this one. Again, the speed of morphing and turbulent displace is controlled through an expression by alt-clicking on evolution and typing time, x, and some number for the speed. That gives you this kind of motion. On this layer we also have Gaussian blur to soften the whole shape. There is also a gradient ramp where the top part has a darker tone and the brighter part is at the bottom. The background is just as solid with a gradient ramp as well. The top color is almost black, that is very dark blue, and the bottom is this blue shade. If you compare it, it's pretty much identical. You can also make two smaller shapes instead of this big one and slightly lower the turbulence settings and change the displacement for a bit different results. Now, once you finish that part, it's time to animate transition from Google Maps background to blue background. In the timeline you set this pre-composition as a track matte for the Google Maps background and choose track matte inverted. And on the Google Maps layer, we add BCC blob swipe effect. Set background to blue background, that's our layer. Animate percents and increase scale and softness. The bigger the scale, the bigger blobs appear and faster animation happens from fewer blobs on screen. And then we animate percent done from 0 to 100 over the period when the pins and lines are disappearing from the screen. And yeah, one more thing, I almost forgot the shadow on top of the map, the blur, the color shifting on the map lines, and the green glass screen overlay. We will run over these. For this heavy shading on the top part of the map, we just create a large black solid and make a mask in this area. You can see that if I delete the mask, the solid is actually bigger, much bigger than the composition. The important thing is to use a high mask feather for a soft transition. This layer sits all the way at the bottom, just above the background layer, so it doesn't affect any other objects in the scene. The only animation on this layer is an opacity fade in when we enter the scene at this moment. The color shifting here is done differently compared to the beginning of the clip. This time using optics compensation and 3D glasses. Set the value here around 20 to 25 as we said, check reverse lens, and then in 3D glasses on the adjustment layer with this effect, set 3D view to balance color red-blue and balance amount around 8. In the original clip we can see the effect mostly affects the edges of the image, so I added a mask in the center of the layer, click subtract, which inverts the mask so the effect works outside of this rectangle. Of course, increase the mask feather so we don't get harsh transitions. This adjustment layer is placed at the very bottom under all the layers in this scene except the background map image, because we only need the effect on the map, not on the pins and the lines. Both the upper shadow layer and this layer don't need to be 3D at all. As for the blur, it's also an adjustment layer, but this one is at the top and affects everything in this scene. It's set to a relatively low value around 22 to 25, maybe slightly higher if you want. The same thing applies here with the previous layer. We have a mask set to subtract with a high feather. And the last thing is a green glass screen overlay over these two scenes, just to add some subtle details, and honestly I think it looks better. Set the blending mode to overlay and keep the opacity really low, around 3 to 4%, no need more than that. Check out the difference. I think it adds a bit of extra flair. I will also leave this one in assets down in description for you. Scene 4, where we'll handle these two small icons popping into the screen, then that interesting part where they explode, and at the same time they reveal the scene with a human face, where the zip2 icon becomes his eye and gradually disappears, which I spent quite some time recreating to make it believable. Then a smooth transition into the next scene, so let's dive in. But before we start the new scene, it's important to note that when you start a new scene like this, you can absolutely delete everything from previous scenes, because it makes working in the program much faster and easier, and keeps your timeline cleaner. As you can see, as soon as the pins and lines disappeared from the last scene, I trim them down with Alt button plus square bracket. This applies to all layers, objects and backgrounds as soon as the new scene takes over. Okay, these two icons consist of several layers and effects. To keep them organized and make sure an adjustment layer doesn't affect all the layers below in the main composition, we need to pre-compose them. If you open one of the pre-comps, we see it consists of a circle shape, blue background, with only a gradient ramp effect on it, as you can see the settings. Then we have a random icon from NCSA web browser from the 90s, it's from our script, which has a subtle drop shadow pointing to the right. Distance 23, softness 17, opacity 55, you can tweak this however you like, it's easy. And most importantly, the adjustment layer with two aberration effects, green and blue. I'm not going to explain this aberration effect again, you can see the settings and where the point of interest is. On the second pre-comp, I applied optics composition and 3D glasses directly on pre-comp, not inside the pre-comp on adjustment layer, and you can see the results. Here, the VR aberration actually works better. There's even a third way to make these shifted colors, using Deep Glow 2. Just go to Style, Chromatic Aberrations. You decide which one looks the best among these three. And while we're already talking about Deep Glow, I also added Deep Glow 2 on the adjustment layer for its main purpose, but at extremely low values, just to give a slight glow effect. Now let's get to the most important part, the shadow effect. This is applied to an adjustment layer inside of pre-composition. None of these layers need to be 3D, and the pre-comp itself doesn't need to be 3D either, because we didn't parent the pre-comp to a null object, so there is no movement in 3D space for them. Now how it's made. Go into Effect Settings, go here View, Rendered, so we see how it looks, then Render, All, open Shape, Pattern, and you can see a lot of patterns and textures here. Go with the glass, so we get a glassy piece texture. Then we have repetitions control, which means how many small pieces will appear when the object shatters. I set it around 35, but you can increase or decrease as you like. In the original clip, I think it's slightly fewer than mine. You can see if I increase the number in the middle of animation, how it affects the effect. Next one is extrusion depth, which represents the thickness of pieces in 3D space. I set it to 0.22, but the original clip might use a slightly higher number. It's purely up to you and what looks good for you. If I increase the amount, you can see how the pieces become longer in depth. Next one is Force 1, where the animation happens. We need to animate the radius and the strength of the explosion. Radius actually represents the area of influence of the force on the object. It is not the same as strength. So if you keep the value low, the force will hit the center point and the object will start breaking apart outward from the center. Strength is what actually determines how strongly and how fast these pieces will fly away from the object. If you increase the radius, it doesn't mean the pieces will break apart more. It means the force affects the objects more evenly from all sides. In fact, the opposite can happen. The object may hold together because the entire object receives the same force in the same direction at the same time. As you can see, I animated both from 0 to 0.14 for radius and 4.35 for strength. Rotation and randomness are optional, you can use them or not. Then we have viscosity. 0 means pieces react extremely to any change in strength, gravity and other similar settings, while number 1 behaves like a gel, making pieces harder to move. I would actually keep it between 0.02 to 0.15, depending on the scene. And then we have mass variation. I don't touch it, it determines how much the mass of the pieces will differ, creating slightly different motions. And finally, gravity. The word says it all. Very important too, if you decrease it, pieces fall slowly. If you set it to 0, they won't fall at all, and their movement depends entirely on strength, radius and viscosity. It actually dictates what happens to the pieces after the object shatters, whether strength carries them sideways or gravity start pulling them downway. If you set like I did, assuming the settings are the same as without gravity, the pieces will shatter in the same initial direction, but the gravity will pull them down, changing their trajectory naturally. What I also wanted to show you is that in the original clip you can see they didn't spend much time on this effect. You can see how the pieces roughly disappear along this line here. That means the pieces fell outside the bounds of the precomposition, inside of precomposition. This can be fixed by creating a null object inside, parenting the icon and background, scaling them down, increasing the size of the adjustment layer, and in the main composition scaling up the whole layer, but this will reduce the image quality. You can also fix it by making a precomp within a precomp and hitting rasterize in the main comp, blah blah blah. But to keep it simple, this effect is something that takes like 2 seconds, and honestly only if someone's pay you $200 per minute of animation you could care about it. But this way, nah. For now, a simple way to fix this subtly is to apply a mask over the precomposition in the main comp and add a small mask feather, just so the disappearance looks a bit softer. I can explain how the animation could look differently by changing the parameters, but that would take time. Still, we are not making a tutorial about the shadow effect, but a much broader picture. I hope you understand. Any question for this? Comment section. Let's go further. Now comes the hardest part to replicate, a human face scene, which I couldn't fully nail. In the original clip, this effect is so well done, it looks like a real water flowing over the face. I'm not sure how they achieved such a clear look, but let's do our best. First, asset generation. Open Gemini and I got this result with this prompt, which was enough to start working. It might look too bright to you, but we'll adjust everything with effects. Upscale the image, place the face image on the timeline, then immediately pre-compose it. In this case you can click either of these two options since we don't have any effects yet. We'll click for the first one, get 1/1 aspect ratio for the image itself, which can make this scene easier. Inside the pre-composition, name this image face raw, then duplicate it and name another one with face copy. This is where we will apply the effects. Then we create one large black solid that will serve as a black vignette. You scale it up like this and then create a mask in this shape so that only the edges of the image are black. So we go down to inverted and set high mask feather around 150-200, which I think does the job. Then we create a new solid that we'll call noise. This is where the fun starts. On it we apply turbulent noise effect. Fractal type has many different options. For my scene I use dynamic twist, but as you can see it's not exactly the same and there are probably many other options that can give the similar results with different settings. For noise type I went with soft linear. Now, for anything to actually happen, there needs to be contrast between the noise and the solid, which is black. The contrast needs to go very high, let's say around 750, and brightness should be somewhere around -40 to -70. As for overflow, mine is set to clip, but other types can work as well depending on your settings and the scene. Whichever you choose is okay for this dark scene and won't make huge difference. In other scenes it would make more sense to go deeper about this setting. What's also important now is that you go to transform. You uncheck the uniform scaling and push the width a bit harder so you can get these vertical streaks rather than cloudy look. Here you can also manually try to scale the entire noise layer, not just the turbulent scale. You can get slightly different results that way. You can see that my layer is a bit larger than the composition. Now this needs to be animated through evolution. Set the first keyframe at the start, then go to the end of animation and set it to 5 to 6x. You can see how stretched mine is, around 15 seconds and almost 7x, while the animation itself actually runs only until here, when the effect begins to pull back and move into another scene. The speed of the shadows moving across the face depends on the evolution and how many cycles it complete. Then we keep the complexity at very low values. If you raise this value, you'll see much sharper shapes and shadows. I'm explaining my own settings here, since they are obviously not identical. Their video looks like it has slightly higher complexity than mine. Now go for the face copy layer and apply the displacement map, which we now need to connect to where it reads its pixel from. We do that here under the map layer. Select the noise layer and set both of these to luminance, which means the pixel displacement is driven by brightness. That's why we talk about the contrast and brightness in turbulent noise effect, because displacement map will use that difference. On this layer we will also apply turbulent displace. We used this effect earlier on the tree in the first scene, and here it will serve to create that underwater face movement. For turbulent displace, amount and size shouldn't be that high. It needs to stay subtle so it doesn't deform the entire head. Then we animate this effect by Alt plus left click on evolution and typing time times 150 or 200, depends on how fast you want the effect to be. Now that we have added the displacement map, we go to the noise layer, set it first to multiply, and now we got these black blotches, like Sasuke's curse mark on his neck. Then we go to track matte, find the face copy layer. Here we have alpha matte, we switch it to luma matte, and then click invert matte, and we get something like this. Is it different than original? Yes. Does the scene last 2 seconds? Also yes, meaning it does its job. However, let's upgrade it a bit. We go to face raw layer, add curves, grab the graph and adjust it roughly like this, to give it that cinematic feel. Then I also add a lumetri color where you can see the settings. I simply raise the contrast, lower the whites and push the shadows to the maximum. I also slightly boost the saturation and temperature because the image was washed out at the beginning. Then we turn our face copy layer on visible and set blending mode to overlay. Now I would add a few more things here. Let's duplicate the noise layer so we can add a second pattern that looks like a lines in water. To clearly see what we are doing, we'll temporarily disable the first noise layer. Go into duplicated noise layer, change the fractal type to strings, then lower the contrast slightly, increase the brightness so it's around 0 or in plus, slightly increase the width and drastically increase the height. You'll start to see this cool effect forming. The height value determines how many of these strings appear on screen. If you lower the height, you compress the shadows, which creates more lines and makes the effect more aggressive and less natural. So I'd keep it somewhere around 170, even up to 220 in this case. And I think we should reduce the evolution amount by about 2 cycles so the shadow lines move more subtle. If we turn the original noise back, it might look too busy, so I'd reduce the main noise layer opacity to around 70-80% and maybe slightly increase its height in the transform settings to reduce the amount of shadowing. While we are on the main layer, I'd also animate the turbulence offset to create the feeling that the shadow is slightly shifting to the side. We'll animate it from where the evolution starts to where it ends, moving the anchor point roughly this much. I'm even considering slightly slowing down the animation speed too, but we will see. Then we move to face copy layer, which sits on overlay as a supplement to raw layer underneath. There I added CC glass on an adjustment layer to get this cool light distortion. And let's set some settings roughly like this, just to emphasize the brighter pixels so they look more like real water. We'll also add a keyframe here like this, and you can see the difference when I toggle the effect on and off. I think it works really well. You can add some more keyframes for other settings too, but I think this is enough. And finally, on top of everything, I optionally added this 4 color gradient with blue tones and keyframed it to move slightly, just to give that blue-green underwater vibe, with the blending mode set to overlay and opacity lowered to around 20 to 30%. On top of these layers, we also have two zip-to images, scaled down and set to screen mode at just 2% opacity, just to make the scene a bit more interesting. By the way, I recreated the entire face scene, which I actually think turned out better than the one in my original clip before making this tutorial. But since I don't feel like setting up the whole scene again in 3D space, when the time comes I will use the old pre-composition of this face while explaining the movement in entire scene. Now that we've finished all the elements of the scene, we move on to explaining the layering, the movement inside the scene and the remaining effects. So if we look once again, we can see the entrance of these two small circles and subtle movement of a zip-to circle. First, notice in the timeline where these two circles are placed. They are above the human face pre-composition we showed earlier, even though the face appears after them. They can actually be 2D because when they explode we didn't parent them to any null object. Otherwise, the movement caused by explosion would look a bit ugly and unnatural if it was linked to a null object in 3D space. So the movement of these two circles is manual, meaning they are not connected to any null object. You just animate one position, copy paste position to another layer, and that's it. The same applies to zip-to circle. This subtle movement is also a manual. Now what we see here, we need to prepare and set up the scene behind this one before it even appears, because we can see that the face reveals, moves, and suddenly the zip circle starts following the eye at the same time. This is done by creating a new null object which starts moving from the moment of the face reveal and pulls both the face and the zip circle along with it. For example, if we turn off these circles and the blue background just to see what's happening, we turn off this and this and click on the human face layer. It has a mask through which we animate this reveal effect from the circle. If we delete the mask, you'll see the layer isn't actually behind the blue background at all, but rather above it, because when it starts revealing, it needs to be in front of the blue background and still below the zip-to circles. So let's create it together. You set the initial position of the face composition by going to the end of the null movement, and there you literally set up the scene the way you want it to look, by moving and scaling the face layer, not the null object settings. Only after we set the scene to look exactly how we want it to look in the end, and once we are sure there is no empty space visible at any point, that's when we move on to creating the revealing mask. We click on the layer, then click on the circle to create the circle mask, and now it's very important to center the human mask to center of the zip-to circle, because when it starts revealing, it will miss the eye if it's not centered well. Once that's set, press M for the mask, then go down to mask expansion. Then we expand the mask, you can see what happens. It's very simple. This is the only thing we need to animate over time, while the human face layer follows its null object for the movement, simultaneously expanding the mask and creating this face reveal effect in the same time. You expand the mask to the maximum, so the entire layer is fully visible, basically as if the mask doesn't exist at all. The speed of that expansion is controlled by using larger values, because that means the mask reaches its real maximum faster and reveals the whole layer sooner. Along with that, you should also animate the mask feather, gradually increasing it so we get that soft, smooth transition. Now we are left with just one thing, the animation where the zip-to element kind of eats itself. That's the same mask expansion effect but inverted here. So here's the small problem. To animate mask expansion, a mask has to exist, of course. And we don't have a mask on the zip-to image at this point. If you create a mask now and animate the mask expansion inward like this, we forget that this layer also exists in the previous scenes. That means we would have to go back to the zoom out scene and set the mask expansion there to some huge value. Because if you stay at the same amount from this face scene, we'll see a problem right here. So in this case, you can just raise the value to something like 1000 and the problem disappears. So basically, place a large mask expansion keyframe at the part of this video, and literally one frame before the scene where the zip-to image starts eating itself, set a keyframe so the mask expansion is at 0. Then on the first frame of the animation where the image starts eating itself, you need to manually adjust the value to see exactly when the mask expansion begins animating inward. That depends on the size of the image, the mask, and other factors. In my case, it was around -200. The more accurate this number is, the easier it will be to tune the animation and the speed, since that's the value where it starts reacting and continuing further into negative values. The second option is, before we even make a mask for zip-to image inside, we simply split the layer with Ctrl+Shift+D, and only on that new layer we create the mask. And from that moment on, that mask applies only on that new layer, without affecting anything before that. The good thing is that when you split the layer, it still follows all the movement of the original layer, as long as there are keyframes, like here where I'm showing it. And you can see below the scale and position are still respected. Even though this is now a separate layer, it still follows the original movement from original layer, and you can independently adjust the position if you want. As it for the overall movement, we have that main null that moves the face and the zip-to icon at the beginning. Then that null is parented to the next null you can see by the name, and that one is responsible for the subtle sideways movement in the scene. And in the same time, it's responsible for the Z-axis movement, meaning the camera slowly pushes closer to the face. You can see the constant overlapping of the null objects, so we keep that smooth movement throughout the entire scene. Now if we click on the graph editor of the first and second null, you'll see the first one, if we click like this in the timeline, you can see that it peaks exactly when the next one starts. That means that after that peak, it still continues but much more subtly, while the second null slowly and gently pulls the movement sideways. And then that second null peaks around the middle. Don't blindly copy the graphs. This is very simple, use your brain and think logically. If you want the next movement to start while the first one is still happening, it has to be subtle, and then the following one starts after the peak of the second, and so on. That's why the third null is responsible for a strong, clean sideways movement, because we are changing scenes. And you can see that its ending is extremely smooth, since right after that the next movement starts, which is a zoom in the following scene, but we'll get to that later. Now guys, sorry about the way and the order I'm explaining things, but trust me, it's so overwhelming. But what I still owe you about this scene is a phase transition, and there are two important things. The first one is removing the effects, or more precisely keyframing the opacity down to most of the layers. It's not really about deleting the effects themselves, what matters is that layers don't sit at 10-15% opacity for too long. For example, look at the vignette layer as it fades out. If you jump into the main composition, you can barely see any transition between these two scenes. But if we go back and stretch the opacity animation by just 1 second, and we go back to main composition, you will definitely see the difference. This is a very important detail if you want your scenes to feel smooth, instead of looking like the layers are just being stacked on top of each other. This is a perfect transition, I would say. And with this we basically transition into Noodle scene. As with every scene, we'll go through how the assets were obtained, how many layers the scene is made of, the effects on those layers, all the movement in the scene, and transition in the next scene. When it comes to assets, you can see they are identical to the original clip. They were created by simply screenshotting the scene and telling Gemini to first generate the background without the character and then just the character, which we isolate using background remover and then upscale it. I'll repeat, this is just for practice. This could be considered as cheating because technically I didn't actually produce this aberration effect on the objects myself. I think the lamp was already generated with this lighting, although realistically, the only that actually matters in this scene is the light rate effect, which I created manually. If you actually want to generate assets properly, the image needs to be generated with depth. The easiest way to do that is to feed the image back to AI, ask to write a textual prompt for that image, and explicitly mention that strong depth is required so the layers can be separated. Then use Photoshop, generative fill, and blah blah. So let's continue. If we turn off the face layer, we can see that the scene literally slides in from the side and it's parented to Nulls 17, which was responsible for the transition into this scene. At that moment, all the layers of this scene are introduced, and they all follow the same null as the objects from the last scene. That means we need to carefully distribute all the new layers along the Z-axis in order to get the right timing for all those layers. With that in mind, the scene consists of background, the guy with the noodles, the steam coming from the noodles, and the light coming from the lamp that emits rays. They are all 3D. So as we said, the background goes deep into the 3D space so that it moves very slowly. Now we'll set up the background together, but at a different Z-axis position than the original background. So I can show you in a real example how the camera behaves with the layers placed on a different Z positions. And you can get a feel for the workflow with 3D objects and null movement. We put the fresh image, set it to 3D and linked it to Nulls 17 as we discussed, since it's responsible for the scene transition. Now click P for the position. You will see that my original background sits around 2700 in Z position. If we set a new image to let's say 1300, just to show the difference, so you can notice how it behaves. Next, go to the end of the null movement. Bring the background back to the center, scale it up while holding shift so it scales proportionally with both directions, make it just a bit bigger than the composition, and then check how the transition looks. Oops. Oop. Here we see the background layer is behind the head, which is good. And it moves along with the null and the scene. Everything looks perfectly fine up to this point. If we toggle the chessboard icon here, we can see that background is completely empty in these frames, and there is misalignment between the head and the background of the next scene. But the end of the null movement, the background position itself exactly where we placed the original one, centered and well aligned, which tells us that the background is not moving fast enough to match that head's movement. This brings us to Z-axis 3D positioning. If we now set the same new layer at 2700 in Z position, it will shrink. Then we scale it back up manually and play the scene again. Now we see a small misalignment, but it's absolutely negligible if we hide the chessboard, since the gap fills with neutral gray. You can further fix this by adjusting the Z position or slightly increasing the scale of the background to cover it. Keep in mind that scaling up slightly reduces image quality, and the position of your character relative to the background is not exactly the same because the image extends beyond the composition. For reference, my original clip has this same small issue, and I bet nobody even noticed. That's how close it was, and it doesn't need to be perfect, as you see. Now let's explain the movement of the main character in even more details with camera, the guy with the noodles in relation to his Z-axis position. As you can see, his position at the moment is around -1100. and we said the camera is around -2700. If you look at the original clip, we can see the guy enters the frame pretty fast, even while the half of the face from the previous scene is still visible. In my version, we see that he enters the space much more slowly. So let's now place the same Noodle guy, but set his position to, let's say, plus 350. Scale him up and place him exactly the same position as the original one. This would mean that this layer is much further away from the camera than the original guy from my video. However, when we play the clip, we see that both layers appear, but the further guy is already in the frame, while the one closer to the camera, the original, enters the scene much later, yet moves faster through space, and they both end up in the same position in the end. If you were following what I explained at the beginning of the first scene, you'll probably ask yourself, wait, how is it possible that the closer layer enters the frame more slowly? And that's actually very interesting. That's because the camera has its own viewing range, its field of view, and that angle captures a larger area the further things are, while the angle becomes much narrower the closer a layer is to camera. This is easiest to see if we switch the view to top, or even better enable two views, set one to top and keep other left to normal. We go to the camera, click on it, and you can see how its viewing angle widens into distance. This layer here is the new guy, new layer, and you can see that he enters the frame first, even though he reacts more slowly to camera movement, simply because he's further away and the field of view is like that. He enters the camera's viewing cone earlier. If we scrub a bit forward, we'll see that the other layer, the original guy layer, who is closer to the camera, snaps into a frame quickly, but only at the moment he enters the camera's viewing angle. Here. So I don't think this could be explained more clearly than this, and I hope you now fully understand how layers move in parallax scenes. If we now go back to the clip, we can see that in the original clip the guy is actually positioned much further back than in my version, because he enters the scene much faster. So in the end, this is up to you and what you like visually. I've explained everything, now it's your turn to decide what looks best for you. Maybe something in between these two would actually be the best option. Now that we've set up the scene and explained how everything works, we move on to the next layer, which is the light rays. In the original video, you can clearly see where the light source is placed. The anchor point is right here, and you can see the precise rays the light is emitting. The small issue I had that I generated the image with those rays already on it, because I couldn't explain to AI to remove only the rays without removing the light itself. However, I believe the light on the lamp was generated directly in the image with prompt, not added later on Photoshop or some effect on top of it. That's why, as you can see, when I turn off this layer, the rays are still there. But realistically, what matters is that we know how to recreate this effect properly and make those rays move like they should. This is the same effect from the beginning of the video, where it was much more subtle when the sun on the left side casts soft rays on the character. Here, however, the effect is stronger and produces much more defined rays. I won't explain how this effect is created or how it works, so if you haven't seen that part, go back and rewatch. Here I'll point out the differences and what I did additionally. The point is not to blindly copy the numbers, but to experiment on your own, because while I might explain contrast and brightness, there are at least 5 other parameters that affect the final look, so I'll focus only on what really matters in this scene. So when we isolate the layer like this to see it more clearly, we want to get separated rays, but not ones that are too sharp. You can see that contrast is fairly low, and the complexity is around 4.5, because if you lower it too much, everything merges into a single block. In the light rays effect, all 3 main options are important, but warp softness also strongly controls how sharp or precise the rays are. In addition to that, we use tint to shift the color from white to yellowish tone, and Gaussian blur, which largely defines how the rays actually look. Try to find a good balance. Now all of this needs to be animated so it feels alive and constantly changing. We do that by keyframing the evolution parameter in fractal noise. If we isolate the layer again, turn off the rays, we're left with the noise. If we also turn off evolution, the fractal blobs just sit there, completely static. Once we bring evolution back, those blobs start moving randomly, and light rays pulls the light from those moving areas. So as the fractal noise shifts, the light ray shifts with it. I also animated the center of the light rays to follow the lamp position. Since this solid is also in 3D, linked to a null object, and moves together with it. Its Z position is 2650, which means it sits very close to the background and moves almost identically to it, which is important. Finally, I masked the entire solid and added mask feather for a smooth fall off, so the rays don't extend all the way to the right side of the room. If you like that look, the mask isn't necessary. It's also important for this layer that besides position, its opacity starts at 0. Within the first second reaches maximum around 30 to 40%, so we don't see the lines of entire layer before the scene is properly established. Because if, for example, this is set to 100%, you can see how terrible it looks at the beginning. So parent the layer to the null object that controls the transition between these two scenes, manually animate the movement of the light ray center so it follows the position of the lamp, and animate opacity, and that's it. And the last thing left in this scene is the steam rising from the hot noodles. In my original recreated video, I didn't know at first how to make this kind of smoke, or something even similar to original, because in the clip we see that the smoke doesn't look like a regular steam. It actually has a repeating rhombus shape, and each one is slightly wider than the previous. In the meantime, I figured it out partly, so let's recreate that as well. First, create the pre-composition. Then take the shape tool and create a polygon. Set the fill to white or very light gray, no stroke. After that, go down in the settings, contents, polystar path, and change points to 4, so we get 4 edges instead of 5. Once we created the shape we want, we need to duplicate it by clicking add and repeater. Next, go in the repeater settings and set, for example, 10 copies, and that should be enough. Then go to the layer's main transformation options and set rotation to 90 degrees so it stands upright like this. Now go back in the repeater's transformation options and adjust position and scale. Set the position so the copies are slightly separated vertically and not stacked too tightly. Then tweak the scale to control how they look. This is where we get the effect where the first one is smaller and each subsequent rhomboid becomes wider. For position, move it slightly like this to separate the copies. Set it around 200. Then uncheck uniform scale and set one value to around 95 and the other about 110 or 15. After that, adjust the position again to properly align everything. You can also tweak the position of the main object itself. Then go back to transform repeater, scroll down to start opacity and set it around 40 and end opacity around 65. Next, add the Gaussian blur, set it around 35 to 40. If you're getting clipped pixels on the edges, use offset to fix that. Then add vector blur, set it to perpendicular and adjust the amount for like 30-35. Add turbulent displace, set the displacement type to something like bulge, amount around 15, size around 70-80. And animate the evolution over the same duration as the position, maybe 2 cycles, around 15 seconds, that should be enough. Then go back into the settings and refine it a bit to polish the look. Slightly adjust the anchor point of the whole layer, tweak the repeated position again, stretch it if needed, keep adjusting until you're satisfied with how it looks. Finally, animate the position of the shape itself. Set the first keyframe so it starts at very bottom, then move about 15 seconds forward and rise everything along the Y-axis. Go back into the main composition and check how it looks. After that, just keep adjusting the parameters until you're happy with the final result. When you're done, mask the pre-composition in the main composition so the smoke only appears within the frame, and add a bit of feather to avoid the sharp edges. And that was the last layer in this scene, and now the only thing left is movement, which is also quite simple and consists of 3 null movements. But before we proceed with the scene movement, I should also add that the entrance in this scene, as I already mentioned, starts with a negative exposure that gradually increases during the first second of the transition. This helps blend the dark ambient feel from the previous scene and prevents the edges of the layers from being visible. Now back to nulls and movement. The first one is null 17, which was responsible for the transition from the previous scene. Then we have this subtle zoom into the boy and the noodles. And finally, the last zoom goes over the boy's head and directly frames the image of Elon Musk, which takes us into the next scene. As before, all 3 nulls overlap with each other in timing to create that constant motion within the scene, without any abrupt stops or breaks. The movement graphs are also the same or very similar to what we have been using so far, a subtle start and end, with a strong middle section, since they overlap with each other. And now we move on to the next scene, scene 6. And this one is significantly more complex compared to previous one. It contains a lot of subtle effects and movements. You really need to pay close attention to the position of every image in 3D space. There are many track mattes, shapes and masking setups involved, and all of that can easily create issues when adjusting position and scale. I recreated this scene quite precisely. So overall, the scene consists of this adjustment layer with a very subtle deep glow. That layer is actually present throughout the entire clip, but I have to mention it because it gives the whole scene the overall brightness, as you can see when I toggle it on and off. Then we have 2 large old photo overlays, 5000 by 3500 pixels resolution, one main overlay and another one that's mainly there just to darken the scene slightly. Their resolution is 5K. It's important to find an overlay that looks like stretched glass in high resolution. That makes it easier to move through the scene and keeps everything clean and sharp. Then we have main layers. Pre-composition of the first Elon image, then his second image, and then the light sweep effect that passes over it, which is a separate pre-composition. After those 2 images, we have another pre-composed image that contains a parallax effect inside it, as you can see when I move the camera. Inside that pre-composition, there's yet another pre-comp, but we will talk about that later. We also have the major funding pre-comp, then the fake push-through effect into the glass, into the image, along with these animated lines and text elements. And yes, I completely forgot to mention this brown background. In my opinion, it could look much better, but I wanted to recreate the original as close as possible. The background is also a huge 4K by 4K resolution layer, again, important for image quality and for allowing smooth camera movement without the background slipping out of frame. It subtly shifts with camera moves and adds that sense of 3D depth to the clip. I don't think I missed anything, but we'll see as we build the scene. Overall, it's a very interesting scene. There are a lot of useful things to learn and it's great practice. So let's start with how I got the assets for this scene. The first thing we notice in the scene is the stretched glass overlay and these framed images, which in our case will be photos of young Elon Musk. As for the overlay, we can easily find that on FreePic. Just type something like old photo overlay, vintage photo overlay or stretch glass overlay and simply browse until you find one you like. Make sure the background is solid colored, so you can just set the blending mode to screen or overlay without it heavily affecting the overall color of the scene. As I mentioned before, the resolution should be as high as possible, because this layer sits very close to the camera and it's stretched due to camera movement. It needs to look clean and extend well beyond the composition frame. I'll include my exact overlay in the asset link for free, so you can practice with it. Since we are already on FreePic, that's also where we will find the background. Just search for brown background, check the square filter and pick whichever image you like, for example this one, it might actually be the one I used. Click download, choose the highest available resolution and that's it. Now let's move on to generating images. I handled that using Gemini, which is honestly amazing for this kind of work. First, I asked it to generate an image of young Elon Musk between ages 17 and 25. It gave me a generic result, so I sent a screenshot back and asked it to change the head. I did exactly that, but I didn't need a direct copy. I told him to completely ignore the picture frame and focus only on Elon, placing him in a similar room environment. And that's when I got the perfect image for this video. Compared to the original, it really couldn't be much closer. If we skip ahead in the clip, the second image in the original video shows damaged teeth, represent how the person works so hard that they develop scurvy. I wanted my image to better match than my narration, so instead I generated a photo, exhausted, overworked young Elon Musk constantly work. I think this image suits that idea much better. For the third image, I used a screenshot reference and told Gemini that the boy with the W on his hoodie should be a young Elon Musk. However, this image needed to have a parallax effect with the background, so I separated a group of people using a background remover and then found a completely different high-resolution image of a classroom or workshop to use as the new background for the parallax movement. I think the result turned out very great. I also found the classroom background on FreePic by searching something like room with whiteboard. Make sure to filter for horizontal or panoramic orientation so the image has enough width, and choose something simple since it's just serving as a background layer. And with that, we have finished sourcing all assets for this scene. Alright, let's start building the scene. First, this transition that we see coming from the Noodle scene. It's actually very simple, it's just the BCC blob swipe effect from the Boris package. Apply it to the room background layer and switch the animation to be driven by percentage. Then all we need to do is to animate that percentage with keyframes. As you can see, roughly from second 30 to around 33, depending on what's happening in your timeline and how you set up your scene. Tweak the softness a bit, increase the scale so the blobs aren't too small, and that's basically it. The effect actually works really well for transitions. However, the much more important thing is this. If we look at the timeline and temporarily disable the background, we can see that the scene behind it starts appearing slightly earlier than the actual blob swipe animation on the background. You can also tell by looking at the layer stuck here. So it's crucial that we set up the entire scene before we actually transition into it. That means positioning the brown background and the scratch glass overlay correctly in 3D space first. Notice how, as we approach the point where the previous scene background disappears, the layers in the new scene slowly start to appear, with the brown background being the first one visible. So let's begin by arranging the core elements of the scene in the background. We start with the background. Take the brown background and place it deep to the 3D space, because as we said multiple times, the further a layer is from the camera, the less it reacts to camera movement. In the original video, the background barely moves, if it moves at all. It almost doesn't change in color tones, at least from what I can tell, which means it's placed very deep in 3D space and hardly reacts to camera movement. That's why I position mine at around -7000 on the Z-axis. The closest you can reasonably place it in my setup would be right behind the room background from the last scene, somewhere around -2.5k at the Z-axis, just rescale it accordingly. That's why it's important to use a high resolution background. The closer you place it to the camera, the more the background will visually shift, especially if it isn't completely solid in color, because it will react more to the camera movement. In this case, the camera will move from image to image, and if your background is too close, it can easily slide out of frame. Even at -2.5K in Z-axis, with this background size, it still won't slide out of frame when the camera moves, which is the only thing that really matters. So you need to find the right balance between subtle movement and keeping it safely inside the frame. The next important thing is the scratch glass overlay and its position. Because in the Magnates video, you see that glass reacts very strongly to every camera movement, which tells us that it's positioned much closer to the camera. But at the same time, since it's closer to the camera, we need to make sure it stays inside of the frame when the camera starts moving. We know that later in the scene, let me show you, right here, the camera actually passes through this glass, so the overlay should be placed at a medium distance, relatively close to the camera, but not too close, because it will lose quality. You also need to pay attention to its distance from the image behind it, both for the actual glass depth effect and for the camera move. In that moment, when the camera pushes through the glass, you don't want the image behind it to be too far away. Now I will show you. If I move the glass layer through 3D space, you can see how far it needs to be to reach the camera lens and how far is it from the image behind it. We can see that the overlay is positioned at Z-axis 270, and the first image behind it are around Z330, which means the overlay and the image are very close to each other. But if we try to reach the camera lens, we can see that happens only around Z-1400. The closer you get, the worse quality it becomes, and this distance is already enough to create a subtle parallax between the image and the glass. But now let's move on the main layers, the image themselves. Each image is a separate pre-composition, and inside each of them there are several different layers. What we notice in these images is that, beside the portrait, which has a vintage color grade and tone, there is also a picture frame with this dotted texture. The top arc has a stronger burgundy brown tone, while the bottom has a softer shade. We can also see that both the frame and the image are slightly distorted in the middle, creating this subtle arc shape, almost as if the photo is slightly bent. And then again, we notice these color aberrations along the edges, which almost look like colored shadows. And now let's take a look at my version of this scene. We can see that the main image is almost identical to the original. The picture frame is basically the same, with what I would say is the same texture. We also see the curvature on the image and the fake chromatic aberration around the edges. I also added a real shadows to the image because I think it enhanced the 3D feel even more. So let's start with image pre-comp 1. So we start with the image itself. We generate it from AI in 1:1 aspect ratio, but as we can see, we'll actually need a rectangular format. So let's take another look at the scene. First, we need to achieve this vintage tone across the entire image, and then recreate the curvature we see along the side of the picture. So let's begin. We'll start with the vintage look, apply the lumetri color effect. This gives us both basic and creative color grading controls. Begin with slightly lowering the contrast and shadows, and increase the highlights and whites to brighten and slightly wash out the image. I personally increase the blacks because I prefer the look. Next, reduce the saturation so the colors fade slightly, and increase the temperature to achieve this pinkish vintage tone. In the Creative Lab, I use the SL Gold Tobacco preset to add a bit more color, but that's optional, you can achieve a similar result without it. I also increase the sharpen slightly to enhance the subtle texture of the image. Finally, down in the color wheels, I shifted each component slightly toward different tones to add more subtle color variation. You can see the slight difference when I toggle the effect on and off. You can keep adjusting the tones however you prefer, whatever you want, more color or more faded look. Now if we look at the original video, we can see a subtle distortion around the head area, along with those color shifted pixels once again. We'll create that using the VR chromatic aberration effect, and these are the settings I used. And also I placed the point of interest directly on his face. Now let's move on to creating the rectangular frame and the curved look of the image. We'll do that using a shape and a track matte. Select the rectangle tool and create a rectangle. Then on the alien image layer, set the track matte to the shape we just created. This means the image will be visible only inside the bounds of that rectangle. Now that we have that, let's curve the rectangle to get those bent sides. We'll do that using optics compensation effect. Apply it on the shape layer, not on the image layer. Enable reverse lens distortion and then adjust the field of view. You can tweak either horizontal or vertical, depending on how you want it to look. Set the amount somewhere between 20 and 40, or whatever feels right to you. And that's basically it. Just so it doesn't confuse you, I went back to my original shape layer number 6 in the timeline, and now we continue from there. Now we are creating the background frame. Again, make a rectangle using the shape tool, but this time larger, like this size, with fill enabled and stroke disabled. If we look at the clip once again, we can see a darker and lighter brown tone, some texture, and once again that slight curvature on sides. We start with the shape tool and apply the same curvature using optics compensation, just like before. After that, we add a gradient ramp to get two color tones. I'll hide the image for a moment so you can see it clearly. Then set the star color anchor to the top left and place the second anchor for the lighter beige tone somewhere around here. Adjust it by eye based on what looks good to you. Now let's create that texture. Add the BCC halftone effect. It will initially override the gradient colors, but we can fix that by setting the color scheme to RGB. Then tweak brightness and contrast to get something close. However, I decided to refine the color using a tint effect on top of that. I mapped black to a brown tone and white to a soft pink instead of pure white. After that, you can further adjust low limit, high limit, brightness and contrast to fine-tune the look. As for the BCC halftone itself, the key settings are HD scale, increases the texture size, default is around 5 I think, and HD smoothing, smooths the shape of the halftone pattern. At this point I would say we are getting pretty close to the original in terms of overall look. Now that we finished the image in the frame, let's move on those shifted color edges. Here I improvised a bit and did the following. I created two completely random shapes, rectangles, with only thick strokes, no fill. On those shapes, I applied chromatic aberration and optics compensation, and then added masks on top of that. All of this combined gives me that irregular color shape we can see in the clip. In some areas the color is wider, in others it's thinner, sometimes it's barely visible, and sometimes it sticks out more prominently. This method gives me maximum control over exactly how I want that color to appear behind the image and where I want it to show up. We can make it literally the way we want it to be. And the aberration adds those additional random color shifts, which makes the whole effect feel more organic and interesting, at least in my opinion. Also, don't forget to change the blending mode to screen, so the texture remains visible through the color. You can then control the intensity of that color using the opacity. And the last thing inside the pre-composition is adjustment layer that controls blur and exposure of the image. Because in this moment of the clip, we can see that the focus shifts to the second image below it, while this one becomes blurred, which is why we animate these keyframes. I also added a slight darkening of the image along with the blur using exposure. With that being said, let's move to image number 2. When we look at the second image, we can see that this one was done with much less effort. The image and the frame aren't curved. Both layers are almost in 1:1 aspect ratio, and the shifted color effect is much simpler. So we'll just go through this pre-composition very quickly. Just like in the previous one, the first thing we do is create a shape layer. We'll use a track matte for this image. In this case, you could also simply scale the image as needed and apply a mask over it, since we don't have any curvature on the frame or the edges of the image. I still added a slight curvature, but much less than before. Next, we move on the color of the image. You can basically just copy the Lumetri color setting for the first image and quickly adjust a few values here and there if needed. For the frame, I simply copied again the entire frame layer from the first pre-composition and scaled it to make it more square for this scene. Finally, we deal with the shifted colors on the edges and shadow that I added afterward. For the color, I again created a shape with thick strokes and applied optics compensation to get those subtle variations in tone. Then I used a mask on that shape to precisely control where the colors appear behind the image and where they don't. In the original clip, the color only appears on the bottom and right sides. There's none of the left or top, so this method gives the best control for achieving something like that. For the shadow, I simply duplicated another shape in the same outline as the image and then right-click, Layer Styles, Drop Shadow. Then open the Layer Style settings, where you can adjust opacity, angle, distance, how far the shadow is from the image, the spread, size, and so on. You can tweak these values however you like if you decide to include the shadow. I even added a small aberration on the frame layer behind the image and got this subtle green shift color, which I think it's cool. Now let's move on to the third pre-composition. First, let's take a look at the video. This is the first image out of these three that will have a parallax effect. We can clearly see that the people and the table in front of them are one layer, while the background is another layer placed on a different Z position. At certain moments, it even looked like a background might have its own movement or separate camera inside the pre-composition, independent of the camera in main composition, but I'm not completely sure. What caused problems for me in this scene again were shifted colors. Since I created manually, every time I tried to do this zoom in with the camera in this frame, they would disappear because of some misalignment between the shape layers, the track matte, the image, the frame, and how they were scaled. On top of that, all the layers inside this pre-composition are 3D, and we also have another 3D pre-comp inside it, which complicates things further because of additional Z positioning. But I eventually found a solution for shadows, so let's go step by step. We can see that pre-comp in the main composition is the first out of these three pre-comps with the collapse transformation option enabled. This option allows the pre-composition and everything inside it to behave like normal 3D layers in space. In other words, the camera sees everything inside it as separate layers, positioned at their own Z depths within the main composition's 3D space. If this option were disabled, even though the pre-composition itself is set to 3D layer, it would behave like a flat 2D image, even if the layers inside it are also 3D and positioned at different Z depths. The easiest way to see what I'm talking about is to switch to top view. So this is our layer here, with disable option. We can see that the camera treats it like it's a 2D layer. But if we enable the option, we can see that it now has a depth, meaning it behaves like a 3D layer in space. Now that we explained the basic function of this option, let's continue. If we enter this pre-composition, we can see that inside it we have another pre-composition and several shape layers. So this doesn't feel overwhelming or confusing. The second layer is just a shape used as a track matte for the image or the pre-composition of the image. And the other two layers are basically the same frame behind the image but split in two layers. Also notice that all the layers here are 3D and positioned almost at the same Z-axis values. And this second pre-composition is nothing more than the image of the people and the background behind them separated into different layers placed at different Z position to create the parallax effect. This way I can organize all the elements that participate in the parallax effect in a single space and easily control their Z positions and relative movement. If the images were placed directly in the same pre-comp as the shape layer, that composition would have to serve both as the frame matte system and the 3D scene, which quickly becomes messy. By separating them, the outer pre-comp acts as a container for the frame, masking colors and shadows, while the inner pre-comp is dedicated purely to parallax content. This makes the project cleaner, easier to control, and easier to modify later. However, separating shape matte layer and parallax scene didn't help during stronger camera zooms or movements. It's still possible for small perspective mismatch to appear between the shape matte and the content inside when collapse transformation is on. So it's common to leave a little extra space around the image to prevent the edges from being visible. Now let's look at this inner pre-composition that is dedicated purely to parallax effect. Inside it we have two separate images, the people in the foreground and the background behind them. Before we move on to the technical setup, the images themselves already have some effects applied. Both layers use lumetri color for color grading, and the background also has exposure keyframes. Since later in the scene the camera moves closer and the background gradually becomes darker. Both layers are set to 3D and we'll place them at different depths in 3D space. The exact Z values are not important. What matters is the relative distance between the layers. The layer that is closer will react more to camera movement, while the one further away will react less, which creates the parallax effect. To check the relationship between their movement, add a new 3D camera fast inside this pre-comp and move it left or right. You'll immediately see the difference in how the layers respond. For example, if I move the background closer to the people and place them at almost the same distance from the camera, then scale the background down, you'll notice that both layers move almost identically. That's not good for a parallax effect. There needs to be a clear difference in how much each layer moves. The actual numeric Z values are not very meaningful here because they aren't interpreted in the same way inside the main composition. Instead, the camera reaches a 3D pre-comp layer, enters it, and then reads the depth relationship between the layers inside that pre-composition. And once we finish positioning of these two images, which is actually the most important part of this pre-composition, we can now deal with the color aberration on the sides. Let's quickly look at the clip. The colors look a bit washed out, they don't even look like actual pixels of the image edges, but rather like they were custom made. Here's how I recreated that. First, create a shape layer with fill turned off and stroke about 15. Then add a gradient wrap to color the stroke, using the clip as a reference to see where the color is stronger or weaker, where it's more visible and where it fades. Next, I added an optics composition to slightly distort the shape so it doesn't look perfectly straight. You can skip that step if you want. After that, I applied a subtle directional blur and set the direction slightly to this side. This gives us the soft blurred outline we see in the original video. Then I duplicated that shape and changed the color to something like pink, placing it very close to the edge just to add a bit of brightness along the sides. Maybe it could have been slightly more purple, but it works this way also. Place the pink layer first, set it to track matte to add and lower its opacity. Under that, place the purple one and also reduce its opacity slightly so the structure of the frame behind the image remains visible. You can then adjust the blur setting, depends on how sharp or how soft you want the edges to appear. The most important thing is to set these layers to 3D and place them at the exact same Z position as the shape layer used to track matte for the original image, so they follow the image perfectly in 3D space. One more thing you can add is a subtle real chromatic aberration on the frame behind the image. You can see the settings and the point of interest, where you can also choose the color, so the strength and the look of the effect depends on your preference. There is also another possibly safer method to avoid overlapping or misalignment. Use the shape we use for a track matte for the image and make it visible, which then allows you to go to the layer styles and drop shadow. There you can adjust the shadow to behave like a colored edge, because there are many parameters to control its look. After that, you can duplicate the layer, flip the second shadow to the opposite side, lower the opacity, change the color, and so on. This method is very reliable because the effect is directly attached to the layer itself, so it will always follow it perfectly. And now we move on to the last layer in this scene, which is the light that enters frame over the second image, also a pre-comp. If we go inside it, we can see that the setup consists of two very large orange solids. If we delete the mask, you can see how big these solids actually are. Now, there are two ways you can create this light effect using layers. The first method without using collapse transformation, which means we wouldn't need any keyframes inside this pre-composition or the lights itself. Instead, we would simply animate the entire pre-comp movement inside the main composition. The second method uses collapse transformation, which is the approach I chose. Why? Because collapse transformation has another important function. It allows layers inside a pre-composition to ignore the composition boundaries and retain their original size, which means size of those big layers inside of it. Without it, After Effects first renders the pre-composition as a flattened image in the comp's resolution, which can crop elements that extend beyond the frame. That means if this option is disabled, we end up with a layer that is limited to the composition resolution side. And when the light moves downward like this, we might start seeing the edges of the layer. To avoid that, I chose to use this method. Of course, it's also possible to do it without collapse transformation by simply reducing the size of the solids inside the pre-comp and then scaling the pre-comp larger in the main composition so it extends beyond the frame and can't slide out of view. Either way it works, it's really up to you. As for the light effect itself, it can be created in several different ways. You can use solids like I did, or you could use effects such as BCC spotlight, CC spotlight, or even something like light sweep. What I did was create two very large solids and apply a gradient ramp again. The top of the gradient is a slightly brighter color, while the lower ramp is slightly darker yellow tone. We can see the mask extends beyond the composition and more than that. If you look at the original clip, the light doesn't have sharp edges. That's why I set the mask feather around 70. However, you shouldn't overdo it. The goal is still for the light to maintain the general shape of a beam that passes over one image. This solid controls the main color of the light, which is yellow-orange, but not completely. It should still have a bit of whiteness in it. You can achieve that whiteness either with a subtle deep glow effect or with a regular white solid. I chose to do it using an additional white solid. Set it only about 8% opacity. If we disable it and go back to the main composition, you can see the color looks darker. If we enable it again and return here, you can see the difference. Beside these two color solids, I also added white particles floating in the air, just to give the feeling that when the light appears, it catches small particles in the atmosphere. I think adds a nice touch. Since I decided to use collapse transformation, I animated the position of these layers directly inside the pre-comp. Here you can see the light entering the scene and then slightly exiting again. And that's almost it for this scene, because I almost forgot major finding pre-comp, which is our combinated text from the original video. We can see that the text exists in 3D space and has this subtle jiggling motion. So let's create that quickly. First type the text and create a pre-comp. Then use a rectangle tool, set the fill to orange and place the letter M over the shape. If anyone is curious about the fonts, the letter M is Trebuchet MS or how it's pronounced, and major fonting is Ricaba font. Next, pre-comp everything again and create a new adjustment layer above it. Apply the turbulent displace effect with a small amount around 30 and size around 6 to get a subtle jiggling motion. Then animate the evolution using expression like time times 100 or 150, which controls the speed of the turbulent displace animation. If the text precomp is confusing, it's actually not necessary to precompose here. I only do it for the organization. The effect is about 95% identical either way. If you use a precomp, turbulent displace treats everything as a single layer and applies the same effect to the whole thing. Without that, precomp applies effect separately to each layer or each text and each shape. And if you look at the main composition, the difference is barely noticeable. Sorry, but I almost forgot one more thing. These arrows and the text animation. So whenever you see the camera moving while the object stays fixed in place, you know that object's in 3D space. That means both the text and these lines are 3D layers. So let's start with the line. Take the pen tool and draw a line of whatever length you want. Set the stroke width somewhere between 11 and 20. Then go down to contents, stroke, taper, and to get this look, adjust the start length and end length. Then, click and hold the pen tool so the addition icon appears, and choose the Convert Vertex tool. Click on one of the endpoints and you'll get this option that lets you curve the line, which is exactly what we want to do. Now let's animate it. Click Add, Trim Paths, and animate the end property from 0 to 100, where the 100 means the entire shape is fully visible or fully drawn. On top of that, also animate the opacity so the shape appears gradually and subtly at the same time as being drawn. Then enable 3D for this layer, move it a bit closer to the camera so it exits the frame faster, scale it down, parent it to this Parallax null because the subtle sideways movement is still happening, and that's it. Then just duplicate the layer and rotate it for the second arrow. You also have the option to right-click, transform, flip horizontal or vertical, if that helps the animation and position line up better. In this scene. As for the text, I didn't bother too much trying to find the exact original font, I just chose one that looked interesting to me. It's the ink-free font. If you want the original one, you can screenshot it and upload it to ChatGPT, and I think there is also a website like Find My Font or something like that. You could find it easily. On the text, I applied a gradient ramp, and then I used an animation from the Mr. Horse package, which is free. Download that plugin if you don't already have it, because it includes a lot of useful things like cool text animations, subtitles, effects, transitions, backgrounds and more. All basically click away and free. The specific animation I use here is ease position and rotate and scale, but I also added a blur through add property, blur, and animated it from a high value down to 0 during the text reveal. Because as you can see, it's basically a large blurred box that narrows down by the end. Set the text to 3D as well, place it at the exact same position as the arrow shape, and that's basically it. With that, we have finished everything related to technical side of the scene, the layers and effects that build it. Now we just need to focus on the positioning of those layers in 3D space, the subtle movements of the image and the camera movement. So let's get started with that. We'll start by positioning everything in 3D space. Turn on 2 views camera and set the second view to top view. As we mentioned earlier, we have the background placed very deep in the scene, and it's mostly irrelevant because it barely moves. We also have the 2 overlays we talked about earlier positioned around 300 and -300 and the Z-axis. That means all of our image needs to be placed behind the old photo overlay, which sits at Z300, because if we put the image in front of it, the overlay wouldn't really serve any purpose. Does it make sense? Yes. However, with the image, it's not enough to throw them somewhere in 3D space because their exact position directly affects how they move with the camera moves, and that has a big impact on how the whole scene looks. For example, if you place image 2 much further behind the first image, when the camera moves, that second image won't slide out enough, and it won't fully appear during the side movement we have in the shot. That's just one example of how important the exact Z position is in 3D space. Now, if you are following along earlier, we also mentioned that the third pre-composition, the one with the parallax effect, shouldn't be placed too far behind the overlay. That's because there's a movement when the camera passes through the glass, and logically, the image behind it should be relatively close, so the movement stays controlled. Otherwise, the camera would have to travel like 5,000 units in depth just to reach the image, which is nonsense. So in this case, all three images will be somewhere around 1,500 units of depth maximum. If we look at the original clip, when we enter the scene, alien image 1 is already very close to the camera and the glass, so we basically place it right behind the overlay. You can see that from its position Z330, while the overlay is around 270, which means it's practically right behind it. We will deal with the movement rotation of the image once we finish positioning all the layers, alien image 2 and 3. A good way to check whether you are heading to the right direction with your layer positioning is to compare frames from the original clip. For example, look at this frame and see where the boy's head from the Noodle scene is positioning, and where image 2 is the same moment as the camera moves. Then compare it with your own scene. In my case, the relationship between the layers in the same frame is almost identical. With that being said, let's continue. Now we need to position image number 2. I place it the deepest in space compared to other two images, at around Z1300, although it could be slightly closer as well. If you look at the original clip, we can see that it sits behind the others, but the exact distance is what determines how it moves through the scene. When the camera moves down toward the final image, we can see that the image 2 leaves the frame very slowly and remains visible until the next image fully enters the frame. This tells us that images 1 and 3 move faster through space, which implies that they are positioned closer together in Z depth, while image 2 is the furthest back. And for example, if I move image 2 to Z position around 500, scale it down and try to match the position and movement as original video, you'll see that it leaves the frame much too quickly. These might seem like a small details and the scene could work without being this precise, of course, but if you want to recreate something accurately, you need to understand what's actually causing the layers to move the way they move on the screen. And now we move on the image 3. In the clip, we see that it enters the frame fairly quickly when the camera starts moving downward. That means it must be closer than image 2, which slowly leaves the frame as the camera moves because it's placed deeper in the background. So I placed image 3 at around Z800, more or less. This gives it the right movement speed and it also keeps it relatively close to the overlay, which is around, we repeat, Z300. Now if we follow the camera in top view, we can see how everything looks in 3D space. This is the whole scene. Here is the image 1, here is the layer of image 2. These are overlay 1 and 2 positioned right in front of the first image, and this is the light which sits in front of the overlay. Later in the scene, image 3 appears. It's slightly closer than layer 2, but you can't see it in the frame from the angle because we are looking from above. Now if we switch to custom view, you can see everything clearly, how camera moves to image 1, then image 2, then the image 3 appears, we zoom out, then we zoom in, then the camera head passes completely through overlay 1 and overlay 2, and then we enter precomp 3, where the parallax effect happens. You can see how cool everything looks when it comes together. I think I've explained the positioning as thoroughly as possible, even going into specific numbers and using 2-view mode. So now we can move on subtle movement of the image. We will quickly deal with the movement, or better say rotation, of these layers themselves. In the clip we can see the image 1 and 2 subtly move or rotate, so let's recreate that. As we enter the scene we can already see that the image is rotating. Since the rotation lasts quite a long time and it's very subtle, without any strong peak or sudden movement, I decided to start the rotation around second 25 using both X and Z rotation, even though the layer doesn't start there. The Z rotation, the rotation to left to right, is the main one. If we look at the graph editor, we can see that it starts with a 90-degree curve. This means that the strongest movement happens, so to speak, behind the scenes, before the image is fully revealed. After that, what we see on screen is only a very subtle, gentle rotation. It doesn't matter that the layer itself doesn't appear from the moment the rotation starts. The animation will still follow the graph curve once the layer becomes visible, which is exactly what happens here in this moment. I timed the rotation very precisely by simply adjusting the keyframes, stretching them until the image reaches the exact position we want at the specific moment. For example, if you pause the clip at the frame where the background disappears, the image sits in the exact position. If you check my version at the same moment when background disappears, image is in the same identical position. If I move the keyframes left or right, the rotation changes accordingly. So in this case you really only need 2 keyframes to adjust the rotation. For example, if I move this keyframe, you can see the rotation actually goes from minus 120 degrees to plus 10 degrees. But we will never see the strong movement because the first keyframe happens before the layer even becomes visible, leaving us with just the subtle rotation. Does that make sense? I guess so. As for the X rotation, that's this type of rotation. You can see it if I change the value. It starts in the opposite direction, with a subtle beginning and a stronger movement in the end, right when the camera moves downward toward the third image. This creates that wow moment where the image appears to float in space, making it clear that it isn't just a flat 2D layer. But if you look at the numbers, we can see that this rotation is much more subtle than the previous one, because it only rotates by a few degrees. That's basically it. Just make sure the graph timing matches the camera movement. There's nothing really complicated to adjust here. The same idea applies to image number 2. You can see where the Z rotation starts on this one, even more extreme, going from about 160 degrees to about minus 12 degrees. It actually begins all the way back in the Google Maps background scene. But because the keyframes are stretched over a long period, the movement of the image ends up being perfectly smooth. If you look at the graph, everything becomes clear. It's the same pattern as before. In general, the longer your rotation or keyframe animation lasts, the smoother the movement will feel. That applies to all movements in general. You can also see that the rotation here actually extends beyond the layer itself, because the rotation continues even while the camera is already moving toward the third image. We don't want to interrupt that motion by forcing the rotation to end exactly where the layer ends. Besides the Z rotation on this layer, we also add slight X rotation with this graph pattern. And that's pretty much it for the movement of this image. Image 3 doesn't have any manual movement, and the major found in precomp is parent to a null object, which we will now handle as a part of the camera movement setup. So we move on nulls and camera movement. What might confuse people and make this feel a bit overwhelming is that we are working through the clip section by section instead of following the natural workflow from start to finish. For example, here I separated placing the layers in 3D space from camera movement. Normally, as you build a scene, you also create null objects for movement, place the layers in 3D space and then constantly adjust things, moving layers around and filling out where the correct position in 3D space is based on how you want the objects to move. There really isn't a simpler explanation than that. Throughout this tutorial, I've tried to explain as clearly as possible how layers behave in space when they are positioned at different depths. That's the main thing you need to understand, and I repeat that over and over again. Whether a specific layer stays on screen 1 second longer or shorter is entirely up to you and how you want the scene to feel. The important part is understanding why the layers behave the way they do. So with that in mind, let's move on the camera movement. As for the camera, just like before, we'll continue creating null objects one after another, and we'll parent each previous one to a new one. We start with this null that actually comes from the Noodle scene. If you're recreating an existing scene, you want to compare the position of the layers on screen with how they appear in your own project. That way, you can roughly tell whether you're moving in the right direction. If you're not recreating someone else's scene, then it's actually easier, because you can do everything however you want. At that point, it mostly comes down to your own sense of timing and composition. So here we see that the name of this null is null Noodle's next scene zoom. As the name suggests, its purpose is to move deeper in the next scene along the z-axis. It starts at z0 and goes almost z minus 650. At the same time, we also add a small movement on the y-axis upward, with that intention of creating the effect of passing over the boy's head, instead of moving only along one axis, which would look too static. Once you decide how long that move should last, whether it's 3, 4 or 5 seconds, you can then time the disappearance of this background we already worked on, and also the time of rotation of this image specifically for this scene. Set the graph timing based on where you see the strongest movement in the clip, which is this moment when the first scene is completely disappearing and we transition into the second one. So we apply the same logic in our version. That means the movement stays subtle for about another second and a half, just enough time for the slight rotation of the image to play out so the viewer can follow what's happening on the screen. Then the next null takes over, moving the camera to the right, and that's when we get the reveal of image 2 with a stronger motion. Now, without even looking at the graph, try to estimate in your head where the peak of this graph should be. I'll repeat the movement a few times and you try to think about it. Okay. Logically, it's around the middle. So the graph starts with a gentle sideward movement, gradually increasing the speed, and then peaks right at the moment when the image 2 is revealed. You can see when I move this marker to where the two graphs intersect, there's this subtle tension building up, indicating that a stronger movement is about to happen. You can feel it. That's exactly the kind of continuous motion we've been talking about and aiming for throughout the scene, and only achievable with linking multiple null objects. After that, we have several more movements, as you can see in the names. Slide down to Allen Group Pick, Zoom Out, which also drives the major funding precomp, Zoom in through the overlay, and finally this subtle camera movement once we enter the parallax scene. They all follow the same principle, using very similar graph shapes depending on where we need stronger movement. I won't repeat myself over and over again with the same explanation for these graphs. Your job is to simply judge how long each movement should last and when the subtle movement from the next null object should begin. Everything else follows naturally from the logic of the scene and how you want the camera to move. So that's basically it for this scene. Now we'll just do a rough summary and go over a few touches. As the final touch, I noticed that in the original clip there's constantly a slight softness of the image, something like blur along with a subtle color shift around the edges. So I added a 2D adjustment layer, applied directional blur and chromatic aberrations to it, and use subtract mask, so the effect only applies on the sides, not in the middle of the image. You can see the difference when I turn it off. I think it adds a nice finishing touch. For the scene overall, at the end of the Noodle scene, before the background disappears, our job is to position the background, the screen overlay, and the first Elon Musk image, which we create as a pre-comp and set in 3D space, so we can place them in space and build the rest of the scene around that. That's the starting position. As we create null objects for movement, we also keep adjusting the position of those layers in 3D space until we like how they move, at what speed they react to camera. So once you decide how long a movement will last and what it should look like, that's when you fine-tune the layers that are tagged to the null object. For example, at the end of each null movement, you set the scene to look exactly how you want it to look when the movement finishes, by adjusting the layer position, rotation, scale, and so on. And then you go back and preview the motion. If you like it, you keep it. If you don't like the relation between the layers while the null is moving, then you go back and adjust the layer position in 3D space. In the parallax scene, when the camera zooms out and then zooms in, it's important to place that precomp right in the center of the composition, using the proportional grid if necessary. That way everything stays precise. Following that logic of layer placement, the camera will pass through the overlay and reach the parallax scene relatively quickly. The camera doesn't actually enter the scene at all, we only create that illusion using a parallax setup itself, along with restoring the real color of image through lumetri color keyframes applied to the image of people and the room background inside of a precomp. And finally, if you remember, I mentioned that I split frame of this last image inside the precomp. I did that because it wasn't following the image layer and the camera well enough during the movement as a zoom in parallax scene. So the fix is simply to split that layer and place it at a Z depth that will properly follow the image above when the new scene comes. We still have the last two scenes left, which I'll most likely cover a bit faster since the tutorial is already around 2 hours and 40 minutes long and there aren't too many new things to explain. We have this scene where he's giving a speech in front of a crowd, we can see the light, the particles, the dark edges, the dark atmosphere, there are a few new tricks there. And after that we have a more straightforward scene with just two of them, they are simply separated from the background and that's basically it. I'll be honest, I didn't spend a lot of time on these two scenes and they're not identical to original. I improvised quite a bit. Also in the first scene, my main subject is noticeable lower quality and has less details than original. It was generated with Gemini and then upscaled, but that doesn't help much if the image doesn't have enough details to begin with. The background is from FreePic and it's not really good enough either. The people should be a bit larger looking at him and grouped more tightly together. But if you find a better source material, the principle is exactly the same. And this is what the completely raw scene looked like. And this is what it looks like after the editing, when I turn on all the layers and the effects. To me, at the very least, it looks okay. So let's start from the beginning. We'll keep only the man standing and the background, meaning the audience, so we can build and explain the transition into this scene. So if we go back to the previous scene, you can see that these two layers already appear and are sitting behind the earlier scene. And now the question is, how do we make everything fit together this cleanly? Well, first, as I always say, we place those two layers in 3D space. We'll push the background deep into the space as usual, while the man will sit around Z 1900. Keep in mind, as I already mentioned once, that in a classic 3D scene, layer order in the timeline still takes priority. So technically, you could place this background in front of all those layers from the previous scene in 3D space and it still wouldn't appear on top, because it sits below them in the timeline. As for the actual position, I probably could have pushed the background even further back to create a stronger separation between these two layers, but this works fine as well. Once you've positioned these two layers, go to the start of the null object responsible for this movement. Parent both layers to it, then go to the end of the movement and adjust the scene to look the way you want. Right now it's a bit tilted because the next null is already set up and has already started moving. If I move that one, we get the scene the way it's supposed to look. At that point you can fine tune the position and scale of the man and the background. Then go back and preview the entire movement of that null again to see whether you are happy with the speed and with how the two layers move in relation to each other. And that would be the first step. This is where we pause the camera movement and start building the scene itself. Now if we look at the original clip, we can see that the background is much darker, bluer and lit by this beam of light. The light is not just decorative overlay, you can clearly see that inside its area the background is brighter, the colors are stronger and the contrast is higher. So how do we recreate that? First, let's create the dark atmosphere. We'll make a black solid that will act as a shadow, exactly like the face scene. Create the black solid, make a mask, shape it roughly like the light beam, subtract it so the center stays clear, and add a high mask feather so the transition is smooth. Set the opacity around 60%, make it 3D, and place it at a similar depth as a background. Then switch to the background, apply lumetri color, and the most important thing here is to lower the exposure drastically. The rest matters less because the background is barely visible anyway. Also add a Gaussian blur pretty strong around 50 to 60. Now duplicate the background 2 times. And if I enable my next background layer, you can see what happens. Part of the background becomes slightly brighter. That's because we created a mask on this new background. If I deleted the mask, it would basically just be the same duplicated background again, but this time with the exposure only at around -2.2 and with warmer, stronger colors. We created the mask so it gives the effect of the light illuminating the background, because the light layer by itself wouldn't brighten it like this. Now look at the third background. This is where things change more dramatically. We increased the contrast even more, boosted the saturation, and even added a bit of color wheels to push more color into it. On top of lumetri, I also added a CC glass just to slightly enhance the texture and glow in the background, nothing too extreme. You can see the difference when I toggle it on and off. I also duplicated this final background one more time, removed the mask from the middle, and then masked small parts of the face and body that are closer to the light, as the light is casting subtle highlights onto them. If you toggle it on and off, the difference is almost unnoticeable, but it adds a bit of detail to dark background. And that's how we get the feeling that the light is actually illuminating the room and creating the natural light fall off and image depth. Look at how the scene would appear if we only use the light layers without building these details in the background. If we disable this background treatment and turn on the lights, the result is nowhere near the same, in my opinion. Right now, the main subject is the only one that feels completely out of place in this scene at this moment. So we applied a lumetri color to him as well. I slightly increased the temperature, set the exposure to a small negative value, and lowered the contrast all the way down to so image wouldn't look even cheaper. I also raised the highlights and the whites a bit to bring out the light on shoulders and head, and lowered the shadows and blacks to get this darker, more dramatic look. I also try using curves, which can give you even darker version, but I think the first approach works well enough. Down in the color wheels, I also adjusted the strength of these 3 parameters. I reduced the midtones and highlights a bit. If I turn this option off, you can see a huge difference. Of course, all of those settings depends entirely on the specific image you are using for your composition. Now all that's left is to actually create the light effect itself. I did that with one regular solid in this yellowish orange color. I made a mask in shape of the light so that it covers this illuminated part of the background, and then I added a mask feather, not too strong, so the light still keeps some sharpness in this shape. After that I added another solid and applied BCC spotlight effect with these settings. The light source is all the way up to the top, the target is here in the middle, the cone width is about the width of the shoulders, and you can see the rest of the settings as well. This layer is set to screen and only around 10% opacity, just to add a bit of whiteness to the yellow light. This can honestly be done with just one layer. This extra setup isn't even necessary. So you can choose either to mask a regular solid or to use BCC spotlight effect, which looks more professional and gives you more control. Then set both of these layers to 3D and place them at the similar or the same Z position as the man, or even a bit deeper into background so there's a slight parallax when we move into the next scene. That's it for the core of this scene. Now we add some white particles, video floating in the air, mask the video so white particles appear only around the area where the man is, and place them in 3D space slightly in front of him. Set the layer to screen and a very subtle opacity of around 7 to 20% depending on your particle footage. Honestly, I could have found better particles with more details, but it's fine. And at the very end of the scene I added this face white solid, which acts like an extra brightening of this part of his face and head, almost like a reflection from the light above. set it to add blending mode, because that literally brightens all the pixels beneath it. Use opacity between 15 and 25 and put the layer in 3D at the exact same Z position. So basically that's it. Now finishing touches. I also animated mask path, feather and opacity of the yellow light as the scene comes in, just to make it a bit more interesting so the light doesn't feel completely static. The white light also has its own opacity keyframes. In fact, there are a couple of things with entering keyframes. I animated the whites inside Lumetri color on the main man layer, opacity keyframes on the two backgrounds with subtle light and light beam background, so the whole scene gradually transitions from a darker atmosphere into a brighter one over course of 1 or 2 seconds. Again, I repeat that layer order is very important, especially in this scene. So at the very top we have the white particles in the face solid, because they need to go over everything. Then we have the man and two light layers below him, because as you can see the light does not cover man's back, it is deeper in the space. If I wanted the light to go over the man, then I would need to move the light layer above him in the timeline and shift the Z axis slightly. And then we would get this result, but we are not doing this. After that we have 4 background layers, ordered from the most specific to the most general. First the one that slightly illuminates parts of the body, then one that creates actual shape of the light, then the middle one that gives the ambient light, and finally the base background with the lowest exposure. Just replay the clip once more and everything will become clear. If you follow the instruction for positioning the layers in 3D space while I was building the scene, then before transitioning into this scene, all you need to do is to parent all these layers to the same null object that we already used for the man in the first background. Everything else should fall into place. As for the movement, we have the null after grad core, which is responsible for the subtle scale down and movement in the X and Y axis, since we are transitioning to the scene in a down left direction. And for the last scene I'm not really going to explain much because it's very simple. We just have the sideways movement, and if I start turning the layers one by one, we have 2 of main layers, the yellow mask and this guy and the background. Then we have dark mask again on the sides and the black solid that serves as a transition and helps hide the layers between these 2 scenes, or hide the backgrounds between those layers. If I turn off the black solid, you can see the transition would look like, and if I turn it back on, you can see how much smoother and more natural it feels. So if your goal is just a sideways movement, you should always think about whether the transition will be hidden by some object that naturally covers the 2 background layers from the different scenes, like we had a tree in scene 1 and 2, or whether it will be something like this black solid. If you want to use only a black solid, then the scenes themselves should be fairly dark, so that the atmosphere matches and the transition becomes much easier to hide. These lights also act as a small distraction during the transition, which helps cover imperfection in the scene. I masked the green light clip again, but this time I made 4 manual masks that animate and create a kind of flickering effect. They don't even have to be 3D. Since we're pretty much finished everything, there are still few adjustment layers to add for the final touch. We have a subtle deep glow that gives everything a slight illuminated feel. Then we have the 2 aberration layers over the entire screen, over the whole scene. One of them is masked with a subtract, and it's mainly responsible for the color shift along the edges of the composition. And the final effect is a subtle noise at 3.5% over the entire clip, again to add a bit of texture to the image. And that's pretty much it for this tutorial. I know this was a long one, but I really wanted to go through as much detail as possible and explain not just what I'm doing, but why I'm doing it that way. I think that's the most important part if you actually want to learn how to build scenes like this, instead of just copying steps. Hopefully you picked up some useful tricks, ideas, and a better understanding of how to think about 3D space, camera movements, and scene construction. So if you have any questions, or if you like to get in touch for work, collaboration, or anything edit related, feel free to contact me at pgvisualss@gmail.com. And maybe I'll see you in another similar editing tutorial, maybe even another MagnatesMedia style breakdown. You can always leave a comment and let me know what would you like to see next. See ya.